Story 1. I'll never forget my first year working in the ICU. I had signed up for the night shift because, well, the stories were true. That's where you'd see things that stayed with you, things that never made it to the morning briefing. It was a small hospital in a big city, and we had our fair share of rough cases. It was an old building too, creaky floors and narrow hallways with bad lighting, especially at night. Half of the ICU was undergoing renovations, so the patients we did take in were kept in close quarters. That place always had a heaviness to it, especially in the night shift. But there was one night, one case that settled that unease into something colder. I remember it was around Halloween. The place was at capacity, like always, but this time we had 2 patients who were an absolute nightmare, figuratively and literally. They were at opposite ends of the ward, but you could still feel the tension radiating between them. One was a man in his late 40s, big guy, loud, with this scar that ran from his eyebrow to his jaw. His name was Mike, but to us, he was just the pimp. His injuries were extensive, mostly burns that had him wrapped up in bandages from the waist up. Down the other end of the hall, they kept his ex-girl, as the other nurses called her. She was younger, early 20s maybe, name was Lisa. She'd come in with burns that nearly covered her face and neck, but the worst was the damage from smoke inhalation. We could never get a clear story from her before she'd been put on a ventilator. But from what we knew, he'd lit her on fire, and in some kind of desperate act of survival or vengeance, she'd latched onto him as they both burned. If you asked me, it was like she wanted to drag him down with her. She was barely hanging on, and we all knew it was only a matter of time. The thing was, neither of them knew the other was in the same ICU. There was an unspoken rule that if you were assigned to him, you didn't talk about her, and if you were with her, you didn't talk about him. Some kind of silent agreement to keep whatever hatred or horror they shared from spilling over into our hallways. That night I was assigned to Lisa. I remember checking her vitals, looking over her chart, noting how her lungs were still barely functioning. She'd had a bad night, worse than usual. She was slipping fast, and part of me felt like maybe she'd just given up the fight. The monitor beside her beeped steadily, but her chest barely rose. I tried to talk to her sometimes, hoping maybe she could hear me. Maybe it'd help her hang on. But she never reacted, just lay there, face obscured by gauze and tubes, her breath so faint I'd have to lean in just to hear the raspy rhythm. About an hour later, her monitor started screaming. I looked up, and there it was. Flatline. We called the code and I jumped in, doing compressions while my partner handled the meds. We worked on her for almost 20 minutes, and it was as if the whole place was holding its breath. When we finally stopped, I looked around the room, half expecting her to just open her eyes to jolt back to life. But Lisa was gone. We packed up, turned off the machines, and covered her with a sheet. I walked out of her room, and the hall felt heavier, like the air itself was pressing down. Most of us were on edge, and some of the nurses went for a coffee break just to get out of that section for a while. There was this silence, an oppressive sort of quiet that settled after a death. I remember thinking, thank God she was finally free of him. And then I heard it. Down the hallway, the pimp started screaming. I'd heard him before. He had a mouth on him for sure, and the man hated nurses, hated doctors, hated anybody in a uniform. But this was different. The hairs on my arms shot up as his voice cut through the quiet, echoing down the hall. Get her out, he screamed, a hoarse, desperate roar that seemed to tear through him. Get the goddamn bitch out of my room, now! Every single one of us froze. His voice was raw, jagged, like he was being tortured. Another nurse, Maria, shot me a look, her eyes wide, and we both hurried down the hallway toward his room. His bed was surrounded by machines, and he was hooked up to a dozen monitors, unable to move more than an inch without setting off an alarm. He couldn't have gotten up if he tried. We pushed the door open, and there he was, thrashing as much as his injuries would allow, eyes wild and unfocused, fixed on something in the corner of the room. His face was twisted in terror, his bandaged hands reaching out as if to ward off something only he could see. Sweat poured down his face, matting his greasy hair against his forehead, and his mouth moved in a near hysterical chant. "She's here," he gasped, voice cracking. "She's right there. I can see her." He looked at me, desperation and something else, something primal burning in his eyes. "Get her out," he whispered. "She's waiting for me. I can feel it." I took a step back, unsure if I was even breathing at this point. Maria tried to talk him down, saying, "There's no one here, Mike. You're alone. It's just us." But he wouldn't hear it. He started sobbing, shaking, eyes darting around the room as if he was trapped. The alarm started going off as his heart rate spiked. He flinched, gasping, and pointed at the corner again, where the shadows seemed just a shade darker, heavier. "She's waiting," he choked out, each word trembling. "I can smell the smoke. She's burning. She's still burning." It hit me then, the smell, a faint, acrid scent that lingered in the air, like burned hair and scorched fabric. The smell was faint but unmistakable, and it chilled me to the bone. Maria's face went pale, and we both exchanged a look that said everything. We couldn't see her, but he did, and by the look in his eyes, she was closer than we'd ever know. Story 2. I'd been a nurse for years, and I thought I'd seen it all, or at least enough to stop believing that anything could surprise me. People don't like to talk about what happens in hospitals after dark, what we see, what we don't understand but pretend to. We're supposed to be the professionals, right? So when things go wrong, when something falls outside the usual explanations, well, we tend to brush it off, laugh it off. But I still remember that night, the way the hallway felt different, colder. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed just a little louder than usual. Or maybe I only remember it that way now because of what happened. It was the graveyard shift, the one that always put me on edge. There's a different kind of quiet that settles over a hospital at night, as if even the building knows it's time to let go, to let the night in. My shift that night was pretty routine at first, no emergencies, just the usual rounds. My station was across from room 209, where Mrs. Lacey had been placed. Mrs. Lacey was difficult. She was old in her 90s and her health had taken a sharp decline in recent days. She was confused, combative, frail but stronger than she looked. Always struggling against something, trying to get out of bed, yelling out words that didn't make sense. I'd seen patients like her before. People who, in their last days, seemed to fight the hardest, thrashing and yelling as if something we couldn't see was holding them down. She had a sitter in there with her, a younger nurse's aide named Abby, just to keep an eye on her so she didn't hurt herself or someone else. I'd pop my head in occasionally to see Abby looking exhausted, trying to keep Mrs. Lacey calm, her eyes wide and alert, as if she knew something was going to happen. Then it started. The monitors in her room began beeping. First, a slow warning sound, and then faster, insistent. My heart dropped. I knew the rhythm. I knew what it meant. Mrs. Lacey's heart rate was dropping, fast. I rushed in with 2 other nurses, one of whom was already calling her vitals. 30, 20, and then it was a flat line, just like that. I checked her pulse. Nothing. Cold as marble. Her eyes were still open, staring blankly at the ceiling. We weren't supposed to resuscitate. Her DNR was clear. It wasn't the first time I'd watched someone pass, but I still took a shaky breath as I closed her eyelids and let the monitors go silent. It was over. I stepped outside the room to call her family. Abby stayed behind to do the paperwork, start preparing her body, standard protocol. When I was almost done with the paperwork, Abby appeared in the doorway, white as a sheet. She's moving, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I stared at her, not quite understanding. Come again? She's moving, Abby repeated, and I could see the terror in her eyes. She wasn't joking. This wasn't some poor taste prank. I'd known her long enough to know the look on her face meant it was something I couldn't ignore. I exchanged a glance with another nurse, who shook her head in disbelief. Together, we walked back into room 209, the 2 of us probably looking more than a little nervous ourselves. And then we saw it. Mrs. Lacey was lying there, still as she had been when we left. Her face was blank, her body still. We took a step closer, and that's when her hand twitched. It wasn't a minor movement, not a muscle spasm, or the result of rigor mortis setting in. No, it was a deliberate movement, a tightening of her fist, as if she were reaching out for something. Her other hand followed, gripping the sheets with surprising strength, almost clawing at them. My breath caught, and then she let out this sound, a horrible, guttural noise halfway between a moan and a scream. I've never heard anything like it before or since. The sound echoed down the hall, chilling the blood of everyone who heard it. It was like she was in agony, like she was fighting against something we couldn't see, something that was dragging her back. And her eyes opened, wide and blank and staring straight at me. "Help! Me!" she rasped, her voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't move. My feet felt like they'd been cemented to the floor, my heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was gone. I'd checked her pulse myself. Abby let out a small scream, and I snapped out of my trance. I turned to grab her, intending to pull her out of the room. But as I did, Mrs. Lacey's hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. Her grip was impossibly strong, bone-crushing, and ice-cold. Her eyes never left mine as she repeated, "Help! Me!" I tried to wrench my arm free, but she held on with inhuman strength. Her mouth opened wider, and it felt like she was trying to say something more. But the words wouldn't come. The smell in the room shifted then, a staleness I can only describe as old, damp earth. It was suffocating, unnatural, and seemed to press down on all of us. Finally, one of the other nurses pulled me back, and Mrs. Lacey's hand dropped limply to her side. Her eyes fluttered closed, her grip loosened, and that horrible guttural noise stopped. Just like that, she was still again. The monitors around her stayed silent, flatlining, showing no signs of life. We all stood there in stunned silence. No one spoke for what felt like an eternity. Finally, I backed out of the room, the others following close behind me. We shut the door and locked it, then stood there, just listening, barely breathing. But no more sounds came, just the stillness of the room, a silence so absolute it was terrifying. It was only later, long after we'd finished the paperwork, called the family, and completed the night shift, that I found myself alone in the break room, staring at my trembling hands. That night, as I walked through the hallways, every sound seemed louder, every shadow seemed darker, and the image of Mrs. Lacey's eyes, open, desperate, filled with an agony I couldn't explain, haunted me. Story 3. I worked in a pediatric hospital, a place where I'd spent more time than I could count. It was a small hospital, but we had a reputation for taking care of some of the most delicate cases. Newborns, kids with cancer, severe trauma. The kind of work that breaks your heart and heals it again, all at once. The oncology unit was on the 4th floor, and I'd heard the rumors from the very first day I started there. The stories about the place being haunted, particularly the hallway just outside the oncology rooms. At first, I thought it was just gossip. Nurses and doctors have their ways of coping with stress, and ghost stories are a common outlet. But there was always something off about the 4th floor. The air was heavier there. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the whole area felt different. Even the lights had a dim, unnatural hue. Some nights I'd walk through it alone, and the hairs on the back of my neck would stand up, as if I wasn't alone, even though I was. I worked 3 12-hour shifts a week, but on this particular week, I'd picked up some overtime. It was late, past 3 a.m., and I was in the NICU. I was exhausted, long shift, barely any sleep. It felt like everything was muffled, as though the whole world outside the NICU was happening in a distant dream. But a break was long overdue, so I decided to go down to the cafeteria to grab a coffee. The cafeteria was on the 2nd floor, and there was a shortcut, a staircase, right off the oncology unit that led directly down. I'd taken that route plenty of times before, but not at night. Never at night. I don't know why it took me that route this time. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was because the hallway was empty. Maybe it was because I was too tired to even think straight. But as I approached the automatic double doors to the oncology unit, I hesitated. The hallway was dark, quiet, and eerie. I could feel the weight of the air pressing down on me. I pushed the doors open, and that's when I saw him, a little boy, skipping down the hallway. It wasn't like I'd seen him at first. He was there, and then he wasn't. But that moment, that heartbeat between seeing and not seeing him, froze me in place. The boy was maybe 4 or 5, his thin, hospital-issued gown trailing behind him as he moved. His feet tapped lightly against the polished floor as he skipped toward me, his arms swinging carelessly, his face bright and unbothered. For a moment, I thought maybe a parent was with him, or perhaps he was one of the patients who'd managed to sneak out of his room. "Hey, buddy," I called out, my voice trembling just a little. "Where's your mom or dad?" The boy didn't respond. He just turned to face me, his eyes wide and glassy. And then, in the blink of an eye, he was gone. One moment he was there, just a few feet away, and the next, nothing. No sound, no movement, no trace of him at all. I stepped forward, my heart racing, thinking maybe he ducked into one of the rooms. I checked the hallway, quickly scanning every corner, but it was empty. Not a single sound, not even the hum of the lights above me. I stood there frozen, trying to process what had just happened. My mind told me it was exhaustion. Maybe I'd seen a shadow, a flicker in the dim light. But no, I knew what I'd seen. I turned quickly, my pulse thudding in my ears. I needed that coffee. I needed to get out of there, and I needed to get out now. But as I walked quickly toward the staircase, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The silence pressed on me like a weight. My skin felt tight, like someone was watching me. I glanced back once more, half expecting to see the little boy standing there again, but the hallway was empty. Still, the feeling lingered. I made it to the stairs and hurried down to the second floor, trying to tell myself it was just a trick of the mind. But even as I grabbed my coffee and sat down in the cafeteria, the tension in my chest wouldn't ease. I couldn't shake the image of that boy, his face, his eyes, the way he disappeared so quickly. The rest of my shift was a blur. I kept expecting to hear a child's voice or to see something moving in the shadows, but nothing happened. The night crept on, and the incident felt like a distant memory, a strange thing that my mind would keep locked away for later reflection. But when I returned to work the next week, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I hadn't said anything to anyone. Who would believe me? But then, I overheard a conversation between 2 nurses in the break room. One of them was recounting a story from her shift last night. "I swear I saw him again," she said. "That little boy, skipping down the hall outside the oncology unit. I thought he was lost, but when I called out, he just disappeared." I froze. My coffee cup shook in my hands. She wasn't talking about the same thing, the same boy. "Who?" I asked too loudly. The nurse looked at me startled. "The little boy, the one who skips in the hallway. You've seen him, right?" I nodded slowly, trying to keep my composure. "Yeah, I've seen him." But now it was real. It wasn't just something I imagined. There were others who had seen it too. And when I asked around later, more and more people came forward with their own stories. Some had seen the boy in the hallway outside oncology, others by the elevators. Some claimed to have heard the sound of tiny feet skipping down the halls, even when the area was empty. I don't know what it was or what it meant, but from that night on, I never took that staircase again. Story 4. I used to work as a med tech at an assisted living facility. It wasn't the easiest job, but it paid the bills, and the residents were mostly sweet, even if some had their moments of confusion or agitation. But there was one night that still haunts me, that I'll never forget. It was the middle of summer, but the air was thick with the oppressive heat. The facility was quieter than usual, the staff a bit more sluggish than normal after a long day. I was on the night shift, a job I'd always hated, but someone had to do it. Most of the residents were asleep in their rooms. The only sounds came from the soft hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional shuffle of a nurse's shoes against the tile. Margaret was one of the older residents, but she was sharp as a tack. She'd lived in the facility for years, and though she didn't have many visitors, she was well liked by the staff. She had a little pendant, like all the residents did, that they wore around their necks to call for help if they needed it. The pendant had a small button on it that, when pressed, would trigger a light at the nurse's station and alert us to come to the room. It was late when I walked past Margaret's room. Her door was shut, just as it always was at night. The soft glow of the pendant light through the crack in the door told me everything was fine. I didn't think anything of it, but I should have. A couple of hours later, things got strange. It was nearly 3 a.m. when Margaret's neighbor, another resident, Mrs. Lawson, came to the nurse's station. She was in a panic, her frail hands wringing together. "Someone's talking in Margaret's room," she said, voice shaking. "I can hear them clear as day. It's been keeping me awake for hours." We all just looked at her, confused. Margaret hadn't had any visitors in days, not since her daughter had come by a few weeks ago. We all knew the room had been vacant since Margaret's passing the night before. She had passed away unexpectedly, quietly in her sleep, and we hadn't even had time to remove her belongings before her family had come by to collect them. We brushed Mrs. Lawson off, telling her it was probably just the heat playing tricks on her mind. Maybe the vents were making noise. But I remember the look in her eyes as she left, her voice still trembling. I didn't think much of it, but something about the whole situation left me unsettled. Then came the pendant. I was at the nurse's station when I heard the chime. It was faint at first, a little beep that rang out in the stillness of the building. I glanced over at the screen. It was coming from Margaret's room. I froze. There was no way it was her. Margaret had passed away the night before. Her family had cleared out her room hours ago. There shouldn't have been any reason for the pendant to be going off. It hadn't been touched, not once since she died. My heart started to race. I told the other staff, but they just shrugged it off, muttering something about a malfunction. "Go turn it off," one of them said. I was the only one who seemed to care, or maybe I was the only one who wasn't too scared to go check. I grabbed the keys and made my way down the long hallway. As I approached her door, I could feel the air change. The temperature had dropped suddenly, even though it was a blistering summer night. A chill ran through me as I reached for the handle. The door was unlocked. I stepped inside, my breath shallow in my chest. The room was eerily quiet except for the soft hum of the pendant light still flashing. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt it. The cold. It was freezing cold, so cold it hurt my skin. I glanced around, confused. The air conditioning had been off all day, and yet it felt like winter in that room. The pendant light above the bed flickered erratically, casting strange shadows on the walls. I couldn't explain it, but everything felt wrong. I slowly moved toward the nightstand where the pendant sat. It was still blinking, faint but insistent. I reached out, my hand trembling, and as soon as I touched the light, a sudden bang echoed from the bathroom. I nearly jumped out of my skin. The bathroom door, Margaret's bathroom, slammed shut with a violent force. I stood there frozen. My heart pounded in my ears as I stared at the closed bathroom door. I could feel the air around me, thick and oppressive. Something wasn't right. Something was wrong. Without thinking, I turned and bolted for the door. I slammed it behind me, locking it, and sprinted back to the nurse's station. "Margaret's room. It's wrong," I stammered. "You need to check it." The others stared at me wide-eyed. One of the male staff members, Doug, finally spoke up. He was older, a bit gruff, but he'd been around long enough to know when something was off. "I'll go," he said. He didn't question me, but I could see the tension in his face. "Wait here." I watched him as he walked down the hall toward Margaret's room. The air felt heavier now, thick with something I couldn't explain. I heard the sound of his footsteps fade into the distance. He reached her door and paused. Then I heard him fumble with the lock. The seconds stretched into minutes. Finally, the door opened and Doug walked in. I held my breath as I waited for him to come back. When he finally returned, he didn't say anything. His face was pale, his lips pressed into a tight line. He didn't even look at me. "The door was locked when I got there," he muttered, eyes glazed over, "and there was no one in the room." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. The silence that followed was worse than the loudest scream. Something had been in that room, something I couldn't explain, something that wasn't supposed to be there, something that still lingers in the back of my mind every time I close my eyes. To this day, I don't know what happened that night, but I know one thing for sure. I will never step foot in that room again, not for anything. Story 5. I worked the night shift at a busy hospital in the maternity ward. a place that's always buzzing with activity, or so it seems. Most nights it's just me, the monitors, the occasional baby crying, and the hum of the call lights that seem to go off at the most inconvenient times, especially when no one's there. But some nights, things happen that don't make any sense. There was this one night. It started out like any other. I had just finished helping with a delivery, and the shift was winding down. The nursery was quiet, the usual lull of machines and distant footsteps echoing down the hallway. I had barely sat down to sip my cold coffee when I heard it, a soft chime, the kind of lullaby you might hear if someone had just delivered a baby. It played through the PA system, clear and sweet, the sound of newborn joy filling the sterile halls. But there was no one in the room where the button was located. I checked. No one. I was alone on the floor, the staff busy with their own tasks elsewhere. At first, I thought it was some sort of glitch. Maybe the button was stuck, or the system was malfunctioning. But then, it played again. The same lullaby, the same eerie chime, like it was celebrating something that wasn't there. I tried to shake it off. I figured it was just a technical issue, but something about it didn't sit right with me. I went over to the soundboard, checked the connections, and everything seemed fine. But the air felt different, thick, like it was holding its breath. I went back to the desk and continued working. I tried to focus, but the lullaby kept ringing in my head. I couldn't shake the thought that something was wrong. Not long after, the phone rang, and I answered quickly, hoping for a distraction. "Hello, this is Nurse Name. How can I help you?" The voice on the other end was frantic, shaky. "There's been a death in room 23. It's not good, nurse. We need you to come over." I could hear the distress in her voice, the kind of sound you get when something truly terrible has happened. I grabbed my things and rushed to the other unit. When I walked into room 23, I knew what she meant. The heart monitor was flat. There was a stillness in the room that made it feel like time had stopped. The woman on the bed had been with us for a while. She'd been through so much, and now she was gone. I stayed with her for a few minutes, just making sure everything was in order, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something else was happening. The moment I turned to leave, the lights flickered. But it wasn't just the lights. A soft lullaby began playing from the ceiling speakers. I froze. I knew where that sound was coming from. The button, the one you press after a delivery to announce the birth over the PA system. It wasn't supposed to play unless someone activated it. No one had touched it. The lullaby echoed through the empty halls, so soft, so unsettling. It was a beautiful tune, but that night it felt like it was mocking me. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a coincidence, a glitch in the system. But as I turned to leave, the sound grew louder, like it was following me. I rushed back to the nurse's station, but the lullaby kept playing in my mind. And then, just as I sat down to gather myself, the phone rang again. My hands were shaking when I picked it up. "Hello? This is going to sound crazy, but..." The voice on the other end was a man's, and I could tell he was trying to keep it together. "We're hearing it too, the lullaby. It started playing on its own, and no one's near the button." My heart dropped. He continued, "We're on the other floor, the maternity ward. It's playing from the system, and no one has touched it. It started after the death in room 23. I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. Was it just some malfunction? Some sort of sick coincidence? But everything felt wrong, like there was something else going on. I hung up and rushed back to the nursery. When I arrived, I expected to find the system unplugged or shut off, but it wasn't. It was still running, and the lullaby was still playing. I reached for the plug and yanked it out. The music stopped abruptly, the silence almost deafening. I stood there, breathless, staring at the system in disbelief. But as I was walking away, it started again. The same song, the same sweet lullaby, as if the system was mocking me, reminding me of the death I'd just witnessed. I ran down the hall to the main switchboard, desperate to get everything disconnected. The lullaby kept playing in the background, echoing in my ears. It wasn't real, I told myself. It couldn't be. I had unplugged everything. There was no reason for it to keep going. But it did. It stopped only once I completely unplugged the entire system, and I thought it was over. I thought the nightmare was over. That night, after I'd gone home, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing that lullaby in my head, and the next day when I came back to work, I heard it again. Just once. A soft chime that seemed to come from nowhere. The entire system had been completely disconnected. There was no way it could have played again. But it did. And I'm telling you, no one could explain it. After that, I didn't go near that system again. I couldn't. They eventually got the wiring checked, but no one ever found a reason. No one ever talked about it again. But I know what I heard. I know what I felt. Something happened that night. Something I still can't explain. I never stayed late after that. Story 1. The break room at my lab wasn't exactly cozy. It had the usual: a fridge humming in the corner, mismatched chairs, a coffee machine that spat out something vaguely resembling coffee. But there was something unique about ours: a memorial space. Pictures of staff who'd passed on, along with flowers, little trinkets, and sometimes handwritten notes, filled a small shelf. It was meant to honor them, but it always gave me the creeps. Maybe it was the silence that hung in the air around it, like the dead were watching. I work late shifts, and that night was no different. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as I wrapped up my work. The building practically deserted except for me and the faint echo of a cleaning crew somewhere down the hall. I was starving and decided to grab a snack from my locker in the break room. I didn't like going in there alone at night. Something about the room felt wrong, but hunger won. I pushed open the door, and the first thing I noticed was the chill. It wasn't freezing, but it was colder than it had any right to be. My breath caught as I stepped in. The hum of the fridge, the click of the clock on the wall, it all felt louder than usual. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I felt like I wasn't alone. I kept my eyes down, focusing on the locker across the room. But out of the corner of my vision, I noticed something strange. The air by the memorial shelf seemed heavy, like the light bent around it differently. I shook my head. I was tired, I told myself. Just grab the snack and leave. And then it happened. One of their pictures, flew off the shelf. I'm not talking about it sliding off or falling gently. This thing flew. I froze, my hand halfway to my locker. It didn't make any sense. There was no wind, no draft, nothing that could have caused it. But that wasn't the worst part. The picture didn't just hit the ground. It soared across the room, almost gracefully, and landed right in front of me, face up, and it was staring at me. The woman in the photo, Mary, had been a long-time lab tech before I'd even joined the team. Everyone said she was the heart of the lab. She passed away last year, sudden aneurysm while on vacation. I'd never met her, but I'd heard plenty about her. People still talked about how much they missed her, and now her face was looking up at me, almost like she was expecting me to say something. But that wasn't all. The picture hadn't landed alone. It had somehow managed to snag someone's jacket from a nearby chair on its way down. The jacket had cushioned the fall perfectly, like the photo was being protected. I stared, my brain racing to make sense of it. My chest tightened. I couldn't breathe. Nope, I muttered, stepping back. But my legs felt like lead. I couldn't move. Something compelled me. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was respect. But I bent down, trembling, and picked up the photo. Her eyes seemed brighter than they had any right to be in a dimly lit room. Almost alive. I swallowed hard. I don't know why I did it, but I said, "Hi, nice to meet you." My voice cracked, barely louder than a whisper, and as soon as the words left my mouth, the air in the room shifted. The heaviness lifted. It was subtle, but I felt it, like something or someone was satisfied. I didn't linger. I carefully placed the photo back on the shelf, making sure it was secure. "There you go," I said, my voice shaking. "All good now." I backed away, not taking my eyes off the shelf. Every instinct told me to run, but I didn't want to turn my back on it. Not until I was at the door. And then I bolted. I didn't stop running until I was in my car. The door locked, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I sat there staring at the entrance to the building, half expecting something or someone to come after me. I didn't tell anyone. How could I? Hey, guess what? Mary's picture flew off the wall and introduced itself to me. Yeah, that'd go over great. People would think I'd lost it. Maybe I had. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was real, that she was real. The next day I avoided the break room like the plague, but curiosity got the better of me by the afternoon. I needed to see if the picture was still there, if it was back on the shelf where I'd left it. My stomach churned as I pushed the door open. There it was, right in its spot, perfectly aligned with the others, no sign of anything unusual. But as I stared at it, I noticed something I hadn't before, a small handwritten note tucked behind the frame. It wasn't there the night before, I was sure of it. My hands shook as I reached for it, pulling it free. It was simple, just 4 words written in neat cursive. Thank you for listening. I didn't know what to make of it. I still don't. All I know is that I'm not stepping into that break room alone ever again. Story 2. It was my 5th year working in the hospital lab. Night shifts weren't new to me. The hum of machines and the occasional distant beeps of monitors upstairs were my constant companions. I didn't mind the solitude. There was something calming about the predictable rhythm of the analyzers and the quiet tension of being one of the few people awake and working while the world outside slept. That night started like any other. I had clocked in at 11 p.m., exchanged half-hearted pleasantries with the evening tech as they left, and settled into my routine. The machines were behaving, the samples were coming through steadily, and the coffee was still hot. By 2 a.m., I had processed over 100 specimens. I remember thinking it was one of those nights where everything just worked, until it didn't. It began with the analyzer's chime, a subtle but insistent sound that signaled an error. It wasn't uncommon. Machines act up. Tubes get stuck. Labels don't scan. I sighed, put down my coffee, and walked over to the line. The error was at the barcode reader station. A tube had jammed. At first glance, it looked simple enough to fix. The release arm had closed too early, trapping the tube halfway through the reader. I tried to dislodge it, but it wouldn't budge. I leaned in closer. The way it was wedged didn't make sense. It wasn't just stuck, it was jammed in with a force that shouldn't have been possible. I grabbed the manual release tool and gave it a nudge. Nothing. Annoyed, I applied more force, practically yanking at the release mechanism. When it finally gave, the tube shot loose and nearly fell to the floor. I caught it just in time and flipped it over to check the label. That's when my stomach dropped. The name on the tube was hers. For 44 years, she had worked in this lab. She was a legend, part of the old clinical lab technician program, back when the hospital was independent and things were done by hand. She had been the chem supervisor for as long as I could remember. Everyone respected her. Hell, we all feared her a little too. She had retired the year before after her lung cancer diagnosis. It was aggressive and the prognosis had been grim, but she never let it slow her down, even in her final days. She kept in touch, sent emails, asked about the lab. I knew she was upstairs in the ICU. We all did. She was nearing the end. I stared at the tube in my hand. It wasn't a current specimen. I remembered it immediately. One of her old blood samples, drawn months ago for a research study. It had been processed, stored, and forgotten in the stockyard, along with thousands of others. The system shouldn't have pulled it. There were no pending tests, no orders in the queue. It had been filed away, its purpose fulfilled. There was no reason for it to be on the line. Yet here it was, in my hand. I shook off the unease creeping up my spine and placed the tube in the discard rack. These things happen sometimes. Machines glitch. Maybe someone had accidentally triggered a recall, but deep down, I knew better. At 2:45 a.m., I finished clearing the error and went back to my station. The hum of the machines filled the room again, steady and predictable. I tried to focus, but my mind kept circling back to the jammed tube. 15 minutes later, my shift ended. The day shift was starting to trickle in, and I handed off the workload, careful not to mention what had happened. It was too strange, too coincidental. I didn't want to sound paranoid. As I walked out of the lab, one of the ICU nurses passed me in the hallway. She looked drained. "Rough night?" I asked. She nodded. "We lost someone." Something in her tone made my chest tighten. "Who?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She hesitated, then said her name. 2 a.m., the nurse added softly. She passed at exactly 2 a.m. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My thoughts raced back to the jammed tube, the name on the label, the time the error had occurred. 2 a.m. I spent the rest of the day replaying it in my mind, trying to make sense of it. The timing was too precise to be a coincidence. The system had pulled her old blood, stored away for months, and sent it through the line without an order, exactly as she took her final breath. I checked the system logs the next night, desperate for an explanation. There was no record of the tube being recalled. The analyzer logs showed the error, but nothing about why the sample had been retrieved. It was as if the machine had acted on its own. I told no one. What was there to say? To this day, I can't explain it. Machines don't just do things without reason. Blood doesn't jam itself into impossible positions, and samples from the dead don't reappear on the line moments after they've passed. But it happened. I was there. Story 3. I was stationed at the blood bank one cold, dead silent night. It was one of those nights when the air felt heavier, like something unseen was pressing down on the world. I had been interning at the hospital for about 3 months, shadowing the night shift staff. The blood bank wasn't my usual post. I typically stuck to the lab. But that night, I had been asked to fill in because someone called out sick. The blood bank was in the hospital's basement, tucked into a corner with dim fluorescent lights and the faint hum of refrigeration units. It wasn't creepy during the day, but at night, with the distant echoes of the hospital's machinery and the occasional muffled sound of footsteps upstairs, it was unnerving. There were only 2 of us that night. Me and Ethan, a fellow intern I barely knew. He was tall and wiry, with a nervous energy that made the already tense atmosphere even more unsettling. It was around 2:30 in the morning when it happened. Ethan and I had settled into a strained silence. He was scrolling on his phone, and I was flipping through a clipboard of inventory sheets, pretending to focus. The blood bank's refrigeration unit, the BB ref, as we called it, sat across the room. It was a massive glass-fronted unit with rows of labeled bags neatly organized inside. The glass was slightly fogged from the cold, a faint sheen of condensation giving it a ghostly look. "Did you hear that?" Ethan suddenly asked, his voice cutting through the quiet. I froze, my pen hovering over the clipboard. "Hear what?" I asked, my voice low. He looked at me, his eyes wide. "Like, I don't know, a tap or something." I strained my ears, but all I could hear was the hum of the fridge. "Probably just the compressor kicking on," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Ethan nodded, but he didn't look convinced. He put his phone down and stared at the fridge, his leg bouncing nervously. A few minutes passed in silence, and I started to relax. I had just convinced myself that Ethan was jumpy for no reason when I saw it. A handprint. A single clear handprint appeared on the inside of the BB referee's glass door, right at eye level. It wasn't there before. I was certain of that. The fingers were long and thin, the print slightly smudged as if the hand had pressed firmly against the cold surface. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't answer. He was already staring at the glass, his face pale. "You see that?" he finally whispered back. I nodded. Neither of us moved. The room felt colder, like the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. My brain scrambled for a rational explanation. Condensation? A trick of the light? Someone else in the room earlier? But none of it made sense. The handprint was on the inside of the glass. There was no way anyone could have touched it without opening the fridge, and the door hadn't moved. "Maybe it's, just..." Ethan trailed off, his voice trembling. And then another one appeared, right next to the first. This time the fingers dragged down slightly, leaving streaks in the condensation. My stomach clenched. My instinct was to run, but my legs felt like they were glued to the floor. "Is someone in there?" Ethan whispered. His voice cracked, and I could hear the panic rising. "That's impossible," I said, though my voice sounded hollow. "It's locked, and it's freezing in there." But even as I said it, a third handprint appeared, higher up, as if whoever or whatever was inside was reaching for the top of the glass. This one was smaller, almost childlike. My breath hitched in my throat. "We need to call someone," Ethan said, his voice urgent. "Who?" I snapped, my voice louder than I intended. "What are we going to say? Hey, there are ghost handprints on the blood fridge?" Before Ethan could respond, the overhead lights flickered. Not the usual dimming you get with old fluorescents. These lights went completely out for a full second before snapping back on. When they did, all the handprints were gone. Ethan let out a shaky breath, but I couldn't look away from the fridge. The glass was clean now, as if nothing had happened. "You saw that, right?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, I saw it." We sat there in silence for what felt like an eternity, staring at the fridge. I kept expecting the handprints to come back, but they didn't. The hum of the refrigeration unit was the only sound, but it felt louder now, more oppressive. I think we should check it," Ethan finally said, though he sounded far from convinced. "Are you insane?" I hissed. But he was already standing, his hands shaking as he fumbled for the keys clipped to his badge. "We have to," he said, his voice shaking. "What if there's, I don't know, a leak or something?" "A leak?" I repeated, incredulous. "What kind of leak leaves handprints?" He ignored me and stepped toward the fridge. I wanted to stop him, but I couldn't move. I could only watch as he unlocked the door and pulled it open. A blast of icy air hit me from across the room, making me shiver. Ethan peered inside, his breath visible in the cold. "There's nothing," he said after a moment, his voice hollow. He reached in and moved a few of the blood bags aside, as if expecting to find someone hiding in the back. "It's empty." Relief and dread washed over me simultaneously. I wanted to believe him, but something about the way the handprints had appeared and disappeared so suddenly made my skin crawl. "Close it," I said, my voice shaking. "Just close it." Ethan hesitated, then slowly pushed the door shut. The lock clicked into place, and the hum of the refrigeration unit resumed its steady rhythm. For a moment, everything seemed normal again. And then we heard it, a single faint tap on the glass. Neither of us moved. The sound came again, louder this time. A tap followed by a slow, deliberate drag, like fingernails scraping against the inside of the glass. We bolted. Neither of us said a word as we ran up the stairs and into the brightly lit main hallway of the hospital. We didn't stop until we were in the staff lounge, our backs against the wall, gasping for air. I never went back to the blood bank after that night. I couldn't. Even now, years later, I can't explain what happened. Ethan and I never spoke about it again. It was as if acknowledging it would make it real, and neither of us wanted that. Story 4. Our histopathology lab was a good walk away from the main hospital building, tucked into the farthest corner of the compound. If you think hospitals can feel eerie at night, try working in a separate structure surrounded by silence, away from the safety of bustling wards and bright corridors. The only way to get to it was through an older building, a relic from the early 1900s that had stood untouched for decades, carrying with it whispers of its own unsettling past. I could fill pages with the stories I've heard about that building, but I'll save those for another time. It was during one of my overnight shifts as an intern that this happened. There were 3 licensed techs overseeing the night shift that evening, along with about 10 of us interns. It wasn't uncommon for us to grow restless during these quiet hours, with not much to do except wait for the occasional specimen. The silence of the lab was oppressive at night, broken only by the whir of machines and our muffled conversations. That particular night, one of the senior techs, Miss Rivera, told us she needed to check on something back at the main lab in the hospital. She gave us a quick glance as she grabbed her coat. "Keep all the lights on," she said firmly, "and leave the radio playing. You'll thank me later." The way she said it sent a small shiver down my spine, but we shrugged it off. I exchanged a glance with my partner for the shift, Clara. She rolled her eyes and chuckled. "She acts like we're kids or something. It's just a lab." Once Miss Rivera left, the quiet swallowed us whole. For a while, we did as she'd instructed. The overhead lights cast a sterile glow over the countertops and machines, and the radio hummed softly, playing old hits no one cared about. But after a couple of hours, Fatigue started creeping in. The hum of the machines became hypnotic, lulling us into a daze. "This is ridiculous," Clara groaned, rubbing her eyes. "We don't need every light in this place on, and this radio is just annoying." I hesitated for a moment, glancing at the door where Miss Rivera had disappeared earlier. Something about her tone had stuck with me, but I couldn't quite place why. Still, I wasn't about to argue. "Fine," I said, "but let's keep the desk lamp on at least, just in case." Clara smirked, satisfied. She clicked off the main lights, leaving the lab bathed in dim, uneven shadows. She flicked off the radio, and just like that, the oppressive silence returned, thicker than before. We sat at the desk, our chairs squeaking faintly as we shifted, trying to stay awake. It couldn't have been more than 5 minutes later when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. At first, I thought I'd imagined it, just the creak of the old floors settling. But then they came again, sharp, deliberate clicks, like someone walking on tile in heels. Clara froze, her eyes locking on mine. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded slowly, my mouth dry. The steps were steady, unhurried, and they seemed to move around the lab. First near the counters, then closer to the machines, then behind us. Clara began, her voice trembling, but I shook my head sharply. "Don't," I whispered. I didn't know what else to say. We both sat there, rigid, our ears straining to track the sound. The clicks circled us, deliberate, almost taunting. My heart pounded so hard I was sure it would burst. "It's probably Miss Rivera," Clara whispered, though her voice lacked any conviction. "Miss Rivera wears sneakers," I replied, barely able to get the words out. Then the footsteps stopped. We didn't dare turn around. My breath was shallow, my fingers gripping the edge of the desk so tightly they ached. The silence stretched on, unbearable, and I began to wonder if maybe somehow we had imagined it after all. And then, the chair at the far end of the room scraped loudly across the floor. Clara let out a small, choked gasp, and I felt my stomach drop. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. The lights flickered on abruptly, flooding the room with harsh brightness. Miss Rivera stood in the doorway, her expression a mix of annoyance and something else, something like fear. "What the hell are you two doing?" she snapped, her voice breaking the spell. Neither of us could answer. Clara was pale, her hands shaking. I swallowed hard, trying to find words that made sense. "There were footsteps," I finally managed. Miss Rivera's eyes narrowed. "I told you to keep the lights on and the radio playing." She stepped fully into the room, glancing around as if searching for something. "This place, it doesn't like being ignored." "What do you mean?" Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. Ms. Rivera didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for the radio, turning it back on. The soft hum of music filled the room, chasing away the oppressive silence. "Just do as you're told," she said finally, her tone sharp. "And don't stay here alone again." She didn't explain further, and we didn't dare press her. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, though neither of us could shake the tension that clung to the air. The next morning, as we were leaving, Clara turned to me, her face still pale. "You don't think—" "I don't want to think about it," I interrupted. But I did. For weeks afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about those footsteps, the deliberate, unhurried pace, the way they had circled us. And the chair, that sound still haunts me. I've heard the stories about the old hospital building, about the things that linger in places steeped in history and grief. But I never thought I'd experience it myself. I never worked another night shift in that lab again. Story 5, I worked in a small biotech lab tucked away in an industrial park. It wasn't the kind of place you'd notice unless you were looking for it. A brick building with narrow windows and an air of secrecy about it. Inside, we were surrounded by sterile white walls, humming equipment, and the faint, ever-present smell of ethanol. I'd been there for 3 years, long enough to know every creak of the floor and every flicker of the fluorescent lights. One Tuesday evening, I was working late with Sarah, one of the other lab techs. The two of us had been stuck running PCR tests all day, trying to troubleshoot an experiment that refused to cooperate. The lab was dead quiet, save for the soft whir of the centrifuge and the occasional beep from the thermal cycler. Most of the team had already left for the night, leaving the building eerily still. We hung our micropipettes on these magnetic hooks Rainin made, sleek little things that attached to the edge of the metal shelves at eye level. They kept the pipettes within easy reach, though I always felt uneasy about how precarious they looked hanging there. Sarah had just finished loading another set of samples, and I was adjusting the settings on the spectrophotometer when it happened. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a shadow, a shift. It was so quick, I wasn't even sure I'd seen it at all, but then I heard the faintest clink, like metal slipping against metal. "What was that?" Sarah asked, her voice sharp in the silence. I turned my head just in time to see one of the pipetters, a P20, wobbling on its hook. The thing was barely hanging on, tilting further and further until, clatter, it fell. Or at least it should have. What happened next is something I've replayed in my head 100 times, trying to make sense of it. The pipetter didn't hit the floor. Instead, it dropped straight down and landed, perfectly upright, in a tip. Not just any tip, mind you. An open box of 20 microlighter tips, sitting on the edge of the bench. The pipetter plunged into one of them, standing there like some bizarre exclamation mark. For a second, neither of us said a word. We just stared at it, frozen, our eyes wide. "No way," Sarah whispered finally, breaking the silence. I walked over, my steps slow and deliberate, like I was afraid the thing might do something else. My heart was pounding in my chest, so loud it drowned out the hum of the equipment. I reached out and grabbed the pipetter, pulling it free. The tip stayed attached. I held it up, turning it over in my hands as if that might reveal some trick or hidden mechanism. It didn't. It was just a pipette, the same one I'd used hundreds of times. "That's impossible," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "It's not heavy enough to fall like that. And how could it land in a tip?" I didn't have an answer. All I could think about was how fast it had moved, how precise the landing had been. It wasn't natural. It wasn't normal. We both stood there for a long time, staring at the pipetteur, the box of tips, the hook on the shelf where it had hung moments before. I don't know what I was expecting, some kind of explanation to materialize out of thin air maybe, but none came. Finally, Sarah laughed, though it sounded more nervous than amused. "Maybe it's a sign," she said. "A sign of what?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She shrugged, but there was a flicker of unease in her eyes. "I don't know. Bad luck? Ghosts? You tell me." I didn't laugh. The rest of the night was tense, and neither of us brought up the pipetter again. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I walked past the shelf, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was like the air around it had changed, grown heavier somehow. The next morning, I came in early to set up for the day's experiments. Sarah wasn't in yet, and the lab was quiet, the kind of silence that presses down on you, makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. I went to grab a pipetter and froze. The hook where the 20 pesos had hung was empty. I frowned, glancing around the bench. It wasn't there. The box of tips was gone too. "Looking for something?" Sarah's voice startled me, and I turned to see her standing in the doorway, a coffee cup in hand. "Yeah," I said. "Did you move the 20 pesos? She frowned, setting her cup down. "Number why?" "It's not here," I said, my voice faltering. She walked over, her brow furrowed. Together we searched the bench, the drawers, and the shelves. But the pipette and the box of tips were gone. We never found them. Story 6. It was during my internship at the hospital, a grueling night shift, and I was assigned to the microbiology section. The hospital's laboratory was a maze of fluorescent-lit corridors, sterile counters, and the cold hum of machines. The staff were used to working late into the night, and for the most part, we were left to our own devices. That particular night, it was my turn to handle the specimen logging. The lab was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that sits heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the distant murmur of voices from the receiving area. My colleagues, both the staff and my fellow interns, had drifted off to their usual corners. Some were chatting at the receiving area, others loitered near the lab's main doors. I was alone in my section, a corner tucked farthest from anyone else. It must have been close to 11 p.m. when it happened. I remember it clearly because I had just checked the time while flipping through a microbiology textbook. Exams were coming up, and every spare second counted. With the specimens logged, I decided to use the downtime to cram. The first sign that something was wrong came subtly. I felt it rather than heard it, a shift in the air, as though someone had moved close enough to brush against me. A faint chill ran along my arms, though I ignored it. Old buildings like this one had drafts, and I chalked it up to that. But then I heard it, a whisper. Low, soft, and unmistakable, it came from just behind me. The sound was so close it could have come from below my shoulder. Low enough to match the height of a child. "Hey!" My breath hitched. The whisper wasn't loud, but it was there, clear as day. I froze, my pen hovering over the page I had been jotting notes on. For a split second, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. After all, the lab was deserted on my end, and no one else was near me. Then it came again. "Hey!" The voice was playful, almost teasing, and yet there was a strange, hollow quality to it that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. My instinct screamed at me to turn around, but I couldn't move. It felt as though something was holding me in place, paralyzing me with a mix of fear and dread. Finally, I snapped out of it. Heart racing, I spun around in my chair, my eyes darting wildly around the room. Nothing, just rows of sterile counters, stacks of specimen containers, and the faint hum of the equipment. I bolted. Adrenaline coursed through me as I dashed out of the section, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. I burst into the receiving area, where I found the staff and interns huddled together, laughing about something. My arrival was sudden enough to startle them. "What's wrong with you?" one of my co-interns asked, her smile fading as she took in my wide eyes and trembling hands. "You guys are jerks," I blurted, still catching my breath. "Why would you sneak up on me like that? Who whispered behind me?" Their confusion was immediate and unfeigned. "What are you talking about?" another intern asked, frowning. "You were in my section, weren't you?" "Someone whispered behind me, twice." The staff exchanged uneasy glances. One of the senior technicians stepped forward, her face serious. "We've been here the whole time," she said, gesturing to the group. "No one's left this area for the past 20 minutes. A cold knot of fear tightened in my chest. I turned to my co-interns. "What about you guys? Were you near the lab door?" They shook their heads. "No," one of them said firmly. "We've been standing here. Why?" My stomach dropped. The distance between their location and my section was far too great for anyone to have whispered to me and returned unnoticed. It didn't make sense. My heart pounded as my thoughts spiraled, trying to find a logical explanation. And then I remembered. At the start of our internship, one of the staff had shared a story. It had seemed harmless at the time, a silly ghost tale meant to scare the newbies. She had spoken about a child who was said to haunt the microbiology section, a mischievous presence that made itself known late at night. According to her, there had been incidents over the years, unexplained laughter, faint whispers, and, most unsettlingly, the heavy glass door that separated the lab from the corridor opening and closing on its own. I laughed it off when she told us. It had seemed like just another urban legend, the kind of thing you hear in old hospitals. But now, standing there in the brightly lit receiving area, surrounded by confused faces, the memory hit me like a freight train. The whisper, the child's height, the playful, teasing tone. "No," I whispered to myself, my voice barely audible. "What is it?" the senior technician asked, her tone cautious. I shook my head, unwilling to say it out loud. If I acknowledged it, if I gave it weight, it would make the experience all too real. The rest of the shift passed in a blur. I avoided my section for as long as I could, sticking close to the others whenever possible. But even with the company, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every sound, every flicker of movement at the edge of my vision sent my heart racing. When my shift finally ended, I left the hospital as quickly as I could. I didn't tell anyone else what had happened, and I didn't dare bring it up again with my co-interns. Some things are better left unspoken, but I'll never forget the whisper. The way it sounded so close, so human, and yet so utterly wrong. To this day, I can't explain what I experienced that night, and I don't think I want to. Story 7. I work in a hospital laboratory, specifically the blood bank. It's a tightly secured area. No one gets in without proper clearance. And even then, people are usually too busy to wander in unannounced. It's one of those places where every sound matters. The faint hum of the centrifuge, the beep of a machine signaling completion, or the muffled footsteps of a colleague. These become your soundtrack during long, solitary shifts. It was a Friday night, close to midnight, and the hospital was quieter than usual. I had volunteered for the late shift because I preferred the calm. I was stationed at my bench, focused on cross-matching blood for a patient in the ICU. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, and the sterile smell of alcohol swabs hung in the air. I wasn't thinking about much, just running through my tasks as efficiently as possible. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a swinging lab coat brushing through the doorway to my left. The blood bank has 2 doors. The one on the far side is an exit, heavy with a hydraulic arm that creaks loudly every time it's open. The other is the main entrance, always propped open because we're already inside a secure lab. No one sneaks in or out of this place without being noticed. So when I saw the coat swinging, I naturally assumed someone had walked in to drop off a sample. "Hey," I said without looking up, expecting to hear a colleague's voice or see a gloved hand reaching out with a labeled vial. But there was no reply. I glanced toward the door. No one. The bench where samples are usually dropped off was empty. For a moment, I thought maybe whoever it was had doubled back. Maybe they forgot something. But I hadn't heard the creak of the exit door. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. "Hello," I called out, louder this time. Silence. I set the test tube down carefully, my hands suddenly shaky. I turned in my chair to get a full view of the room. The blood bank isn't large. The entire area is visible with a quick sweep of the eyes. Rows of labeled refrigerators hummed against the walls, their tiny green lights glowing steadily. The workstation computers were all idle. No one was there. I got up, my lab coat swishing around my knees as I moved toward the entrance. The corridor outside was deserted, its bright lights making the emptiness feel even starker. There were no footsteps fading into the distance, no voices echoing down the hall. Just stillness. I went back inside, shaking my head. Maybe I'd imagined it. Lack of sleep, long hours. It wouldn't be the first time my mind had played tricks on me. Still, I felt uneasy. I returned to my station, my back now fully aware of how exposed it was to the open room. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but every creak of the building, every faint sound seemed amplified. My eyes darted to the doorway every few seconds. Then it happened again. This time, I didn't just see it, I felt it. A gust of cold air brushed past me, making the hairs on my arms stand up beneath my lab coat. The kind of cold that doesn't belong in a climate-controlled lab. I froze, my hand gripping the edge of the counter. "Who's there?" My voice sounded small, even to me. Nothing. Just the hum of the refrigerators and the distant whir of a centrifuge spinning in the adjoining room. My chest tightened. I walked over to the heavy exit door and tested it. It hadn't been opened. I could tell by the resistance of the hydraulic arm. I checked the main entrance next, still propped open as always. And yet someone, or something, had been here. I was sure of it. I returned to my bench, my eyes scanning every shadow, every corner of the room. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a draft from the ventilation system, though I'd never felt anything like that before. Maybe it was a trick of the light, though I knew what I'd seen. I sat back down and stared at the blood tubes lined up in front of me. The labels blurred as my mind raced. Then from behind me I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like fabric brushing against metal. My breath caught in my throat. I turned slowly, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. My eyes landed on the far corner of the room, near the storage cabinets. Nothing, just rows of neatly stacked supplies, but the air felt wrong, heavy, like it was pressing down on me. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. No answer, but I swear I felt eyes on me, watching, waiting. My pulse pounded in my ears as I stood, my legs shaky, and edged toward the door. I didn't care if I looked ridiculous bolting from an empty room. I needed to get out of there. As I reached the threshold, I heard a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my life. A low, breathy whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It wasn't friendly. I didn't stop to investigate. I ran down the corridor, my footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. I didn't stop until I reached the main lab, where a coworker looked up from her workstation, startled. "Are you okay?" she asked, her face a mix of concern and confusion. I opened my mouth to explain, but no words came out. How could I explain what had just happened without sounding insane? After a moment, I managed to nod and mutter something about needing fresh air. I never worked alone in the blood bank after that. Whatever I saw, or thought I saw, never happened again. Story 8. I've worked in the lab for over 5 years, and I pride myself on being meticulous. You have to be in this field. One slip-up can mean life or death for a patient. That's why this particular event has been etched in my memory. It wasn't just unusual, it was something I can't explain. It started as an ordinary shift. I was covering the night rotation, where things tend to get quiet. Nights like these are supposed to be easy. Run a few tests, log some results, and wait for the clock to hit the end of the shift. The hospital was dimly lit, as always, with that faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the occasional echo of footsteps in the corridors. Around 1 a.m., I decided to take my break. I told the nurses on the floor, "If you have any EPOC samples, please process them yourselves while I'm out." They nodded, as they always did, and I stepped away to grab a coffee from the vending machine down the hall. 15 minutes later, I returned to the lab. The room felt colder, which wasn't unusual. The AC in our department has a habit of going haywire at night. But something felt off. I went to check the specimen drop-off tray, and there it was. A small, unlabeled sample vial sitting dead center in the bin. I froze. "Who dropped this off?" I muttered aloud. But of course, no one was there to answer. I leaned closer. The vial was slightly chilled, like it had been freshly collected, but it had no patient ID, no timestamp, nothing. Just a faint residue on the outside, as though someone had handled it with damp gloves. My first instinct was that a nurse forgot to label it, which happens occasionally, but then I remembered I was on break. The nurses know better than to drop off samples when the lab tech is unavailable. They're supposed to run their own EPOCS if I'm not around. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands, trying to make sense of it. The fluid inside was clear, almost unnaturally so. No cloudiness, no sediment. I placed it on the counter and immediately went to the nurse in charge of the patient rounds. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Did someone drop off an EPOC sample while I was out?" She furrowed her brow. "Not that I know of. Everyone's running their own tonight." "Well, one showed up in the lab. Do you know who worked with the patient it might have come from?" She glanced at her chart. "Looks like Nurse Carter had the most recent collection, but if she didn't label it, I'll check with her," I cut in, already turning to leave. Nurse Carter was in room 218, tidying up after administering meds. When I asked her about the sample, her face went pale. "I handled all the collections on my list," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But not that one. I swear I labeled everything I touched." "Are you sure?" She nodded frantically. "Positive. Every sample I took tonight is already processed. That's not mine." The unease in her eyes sent a shiver down my spine. I thanked her and decided to ask the attending physician, thinking maybe someone had forgotten to log the collection properly. Dr. Malik was in his office, typing notes into the computer. When I posed the same question to him, he leaned back in his chair, confused. "No one informed me of any new collections," he said, "and I haven't ordered an EPOC test for hours." I ran a hand through my hair. "Then where did it come from?" "It was sitting in the drop-off tray when I got back." He shrugged. "Maybe someone from another floor made a mistake." I didn't reply. Something about his nonchalant tone irritated me, but it wasn't his fault. I left his office, my mind racing. Back in the lab, the vial was still sitting on the counter where I'd left it. I stared at it for a long moment, debating whether to just process it or toss it into biohazard. But then I noticed something I hadn't before. The fluid inside the vial wasn't completely still. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but there was a faint ripple, as if the liquid was moving on its own. I leaned in closer. No vibration from the counter, no draft from the air vents. The ripple continued, undisturbed. "Okay, this is ridiculous," I muttered. I grabbed the phone and called the charge nurse again. Listen, I said, keeping my voice low. Are you absolutely sure no one dropped off a sample for room 218 or anywhere nearby? There was a pause on the other end. Room 218, she repeated slowly. That's odd. We discharged the patient there hours ago. That room's empty now. I felt my chest tighten. What do you mean, empty? Nurse Carter was in there when I spoke to her. She shouldn't have been, the charge nurse replied. That room's been vacant since 10 p.m. I hung up without saying another word. My legs felt like lead as I walked back to the lab. I don't know what I expected to find, but when I rounded the corner and stepped inside, my heart stopped. The vial was gone. It hadn't rolled away or fallen off the counter. It was simply gone. The drop-off tray was empty too, as though it had never been there to begin with. I stood there staring at the empty counter, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Did someone come in while I was gone? Was this some kind of sick joke? I checked the lab's security footage later that night, desperate for an explanation. The timestamp showed the moment I left for my break. The room was still, quiet. No one entered. At exactly 1:12 a.m., the camera glitched for a fraction of a second, a brief flicker of static. When the feed resumed, the vial was sitting in the tray. I replayed the footage over and over, trying to make sense of it. But there was nothing. No movement, no shadow, no sign of anyone entering the lab. I don't work night shifts anymore. I told my supervisor I couldn't handle the hours, but that's not the truth. I just couldn't stay in that lab, knowing what I saw, or rather, what I didn't see. To this day, I don't know where that sample came from, and I don't want to know. Story 9. I work in a hospital lab that used to be the morgue. It's not something we talk about much. It just lingers in the air like the smell of old disinfectant. I didn't know about it when I started my clinical rotations last year, but once I found out, I couldn't unsee it. The narrow hallways, the oddly heavy doors, even the faint echo that followed you when you walked alone. It all made sense. One night during my clinicals, I was in the chemistry section with a coworker, Allie. It was late, the kind of late where the world outside feels empty. We were chatting about nothing in particular, filling the silence with laughter and small talk. I remember leaning back in my chair, stretching my neck. The lab felt cold, colder than usual, but I shrugged it off. Allie was telling some story about her dog when I felt it. A hand, cold, deliberate, brushed the back of my neck. I swear it wasn't just a draft or my imagination. It was a touch, clear as day, and I jumped out of my chair like I'd been shocked. What the hell was that? I gasped, spinning around. Allie looked up, startled at first, then burst out laughing. What's wrong with you? She asked, still giggling. Someone just touched my neck, I said, rubbing the spot. It still tingled, like the ghost of that touch was clinging to me. There's no one here, she said, looking around dramatically. Maybe it was Casper. I forced a laugh, but my heart was pounding. The lab was empty except for the two of us. And yet I could still feel it. The pressure, the icy sensation. I didn't sleep that night. When I started working full-time, I pushed that memory aside. It was probably my imagination, I told myself. Stress, lack of sleep, it could have been anything. But then there was the stock room. The stock room was the worst part of the lab. It was a long, narrow room lined with shelving carts crammed full of supplies. The overhead lights were dim, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and shift whenever you moved. I hated going in there alone, but it was part of the job. One day I was restocking gloves and tubes when it happened. I was standing at one of the shelves checking off inventory when I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, something moved. A figure, a shadow maybe, peeking around one of the carts. It was quick, just a flash, but unmistakable. It wasn't just a trick of the light. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Hello? I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. Nothing. I took a step back, craning my neck to see around the carts. There was no one there. The air felt heavier, thicker, like the room itself was holding its breath. Then it moved again. A head, just barely visible, tilting as if watching me. I didn't wait to see more. My heart was hammering as I bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me. Back in the main lab, I leaned against the counter, trying to catch my breath. Allie was there, typing something into the computer. She glanced up, raising an eyebrow. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, just thought I saw something in the stockroom." She smirked. "Let me guess, Casper again?" I didn't answer. I couldn't, because whatever I saw, it wasn't friendly. After that, I avoided the stockroom as much as possible, but the feeling stayed with me. The cold, the weight of unseen eyes. The lab wasn't just a place to work. It was something else, something that still remembered what it used to be. Story 10. Here's a story based on your guidelines. It was just another night shift at the lab, or so I thought. I work in a clinical diagnostics lab. Late hours, long silences, and the hum of machines have become my constant companions. That night, I was alone. My coworker had called in sick, and I didn't mind. I actually enjoyed the quiet. Less chatter, more focus. The lab is located in the basement of a larger facility, so no windows, no distractions. The air is always still, unnervingly so. The only sounds are the buzz of fluorescent lights and the occasional whir of the centrifuge. It's the kind of silence that presses against you, making you hyper-aware of every noise, every movement. It was around 2 a.m. when it happened. I had just retrieved a vial of QC from the freezer, a bio-rad control, glass bottle, sturdy and solid. Frozen solid, actually. You don't need to be delicate with it, but I always was. It's a habit. I set it down on the table behind me to defrost, far from the edge where it wouldn't roll or be accidentally knocked over. I went back to my work, running samples and recording data. I had my back to the table, completely absorbed in my task. The minutes passed in that strange, elastic way they do during night shifts, time feeling both slow and fast at once. Then out of nowhere, there was a sound. Clang. The sharp noise of glass hitting tiles startled me so much that I jumped, my heart hammering in my chest. I spun around, my hand still holding the pipette I'd been using. The vial of QC lay on the floor behind me, completely intact. It hadn't shattered, which was a miracle considering how far it had fallen. But here's the thing, it shouldn't have fallen at all. I froze, staring at it, my mind racing. The table where I'd left it was solid, flat, and stable. I'd placed it nowhere near the edge. Nowhere near. There was no airflow in the lab. The AC was off. The vent hadn't even rattled that night. The vial was still mostly frozen, heavy, with no chance of rolling or toppling over by itself. I stepped closer, slowly, every hair on my body standing on end. My logical brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe I hadn't placed it as securely as I thought. Maybe I'd bumped the table without realizing it. Maybe. But then I saw something that made me stop dead. On the floor around where the vial had landed was a faint smear of condensation, almost like a handprint. No, not almost. It was a handprint. It was too large to be mine and too distinct to ignore. 5 fingers, pale and ghostly, trailing off into nothingness. I crouched, staring at it, my breath shallow. My first instinct was to touch it, but I stopped myself. It was already fading, evaporating into the still air of the lab. A cold wave swept through me. I stood up quickly, backing away. My eyes darted to the corners of the room, the shadows that seemed deeper now than they had just minutes before. The fluorescent lights buzzed louder, or maybe it was just my imagination. I grabbed the vial off the floor, my fingers trembling, and placed it back on the table, this time dead center. My rational mind tried to take control again. Maybe I'd just seen a weird smudge. Maybe the vial had somehow slid off despite every logical reason it shouldn't have. But deep down, I knew better. I tried to get back to work, but my focus was gone. Every little noise made me flinch. The hum of the centrifuge felt sinister, like it was hiding something beneath its mechanical rhythm. Half an hour passed and then another. Nothing else happened, but the room felt different, oppressive, like I wasn't alone anymore. At 4 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. I logged out early, something I never do, and left the lab in a hurry. The silence in the hallway outside felt like a relief, though it shouldn't have. Silence is silence, right? But not in that lab. Not anymore. I didn't tell anyone about it. Not my supervisor, not my coworkers. What could I say? A frozen vial of QC flew off a table, and I saw a ghostly handprint. They'd laugh, or worse, they'd think I'd lost it. But I know what I saw. I haven't worked a night shift since. I make excuses, swap schedules, whatever it takes. And when I do work late, I make sure someone else is there. I don't care how ridiculous it sounds. I'm not being alone in that lab ever again. Story 1. I work night shifts at a psychiatric facility. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills and keeps me busy. There's always something going on. Patients yelling, crying, or just wandering in their own worlds. I've seen my share of strange things over the years, but there's one night I'll never forget, no matter how hard I try. We had this old lady on our floor, Mrs. Jenkins. She was robust for someone her age, but completely confused and restless. Dementia had her in its grip, and she fought like hell against it. Her room was right in front of the nurse's station, so we could keep a close eye on her. Even with that setup, she had a sitter assigned, a nurse's aide who stayed in her room around the clock. Mrs. Jenkins was always trying to get out of bed, kicking, hitting, and cursing like a sailor when anyone tried to stop her. It wasn't unusual behavior for patients nearing the end of their lives. I've seen it before. This agitated energy, like they're fighting against something only they can see. Still, Mrs. Jenkins was different. There was a wild determination in her, like she wasn't ready to go no matter what anyone said, including death itself. That night started like any other. The usual rounds, meds to administer, and patients to check on. Mrs. Jenkins was restless as ever, thrashing around in her bed, muttering things under her breath that didn't make any sense. The sitter, a young guy named Mark, looked exhausted but kept his post by her side. Around 3 a.m., the monitors started beeping frantically. Mrs. Jenkins' heart rate was dropping fast. 50, NARPA the 30. Her body had gone completely still, her eyes wide open but empty, staring at something none of us could see. We rushed into the room, but deep down we knew it was over. "Flatline," one of the nurses said grimly, checking the monitor. We followed protocol, even though she was a DNR. Do not resuscitate. No chest compressions, no defibrillators, just the cold acceptance that she was gone. I checked her pulse myself. Nothing, not even the faintest flutter. "She's gone," I confirmed softly. We closed our eyes and there was this heavy, suffocating silence in the room. Death has a way of making time stand still, like the world forgets to breathe for a moment. We started preparing for the next steps, calling the family, getting the paperwork ready, and bringing in the body bag. Mark stayed behind to start getting the body ready. He was pale, probably shaken from witnessing someone slip away right in front of him. I couldn't blame him. No matter how many times you see it, death never really gets easier. I stepped out to make the call to the family when I heard Mark yell from inside the room. Guys! We rushed back in, thinking maybe he needed help moving the body. What I saw next made my blood turn to ice. Mrs. Jenkins wasn't dead. She was sitting upright in the bed, wild-eyed and thrashing like before, her fists swinging at Mark, who had backed himself against the wall in sheer terror. "What the?" One of the nurses gasped, stopping dead in her tracks. There was no way this was possible. I'd checked her pulse myself. We all had. She was gone, flatlined, cold, dead. But there she was, alive and fighting like nothing had happened. "Get me out of here," she screamed, her voice raw and guttural, her face twisted in rage, her eyes wide and unblinking, like she was seeing something none of us could. Mark stammered, "Son, she was gone. I swear she was gone." We didn't know what to do. This wasn't a normal medical emergency. It wasn't normal at all. Mrs. Jenkins' movements were jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on tangled strings. Her voice echoed in the room, not just loud but layered, like more than one voice was speaking at once. I felt this deep, gnawing sense of dread crawling up my spine. I wanted to run, to get out of that room, but my feet were rooted to the floor. Suddenly, Mrs. Jenkins stopped moving. She tilted her head to the side, staring straight at me with a chilling smile that didn't belong on her face. "You think you know death," she said in a voice that wasn't hers. "But you don't." Then just as quickly as it started, it was over. She collapsed back onto the bed, completely still. No breathing, no pulse, We stood there in stunned silence, the air thick with something I can't even begin to describe. No one spoke for what felt like an eternity. Mark was the first to break the silence. "We're not talking about this, right?" "Right," I agreed, my voice shaking. "We didn't call the family right away. Hell, we didn't know what to tell them. How do you explain something like that?" We checked her again. No pulse, no signs of life. This time she stayed dead. I still think about that night. I've tried to rationalize it, to chalk it up to some weird medical anomaly, but deep down, I know better. I've seen death before, and whatever happened in that room wasn't normal. It was something else, something I hope I never see again. Story 2. I've worked as a nurse in Louisiana for years, and let me tell you, there's not much I haven't seen. People come into the hospital with all kinds of stories, from swamp injuries to strange infections nobody can explain. But there's one experience I'll never forget, and it still makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up when I think about it. A few weeks ago, I was assigned to care for Mrs. Delphine Boudreau, a well-known card reader in town. Now, if you've lived in southern Louisiana long enough, you know folks here have strong ties to things beyond this world. Hoodoo, voodoo, fortune tellers, none of it's out of place. People swear by their gree-gree bags and consult readers for everything from love troubles to finding lost dogs. I wasn't a big believer in all that, but I'd gone to see Delphine about 10 years back when my life was in shambles. She read my cards and told me things she shouldn't have known. Things I'd never said out loud. Stuff that kept me up at night for months after. She was the real deal, or at least that's what I thought at the time. I never went back, though. Something about the whole experience unsettled me too much. So imagine my surprise when I walked into her hospital room that Monday morning and saw her lying there, looking frail and worn down. Her daughter Marie was sitting by the bed, dabbing at her mother's forehead with a damp cloth. "She's been real tired today," Marie told me. "Can barely keep her eyes open." Delphine gave me a weak smile, her lips dry and cracked. She looked nothing like the powerful woman I remembered. Still, I went about my duties, checking her vitals and making sure she was comfortable. Her heart rate was slow, but not alarming. Over the next couple of days, Delphine stayed quiet, drifting in and out of sleep. Her energy was gone, like something had drained her completely. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I told myself it was just because I knew who she was and what she did. Then came Thursday afternoon. I walked into her room to check on her again, clipboard in hand, expecting to see the same lethargic patient. Instead, I found Marie standing by the bed, panic etched across her face. Delphine was completely unresponsive. "Mama, wake up!" Marie was shaking her gently. "Come on, Mama!" I rushed over, heart pounding. Delphine's face was pale, her lips tinged with blue. I felt for a pulse and found it. Barely there. Weak and thready. Her breathing was shallow, almost non-existent. "Delphine?" I called her name loudly, trying to get a response. Nothing. I knew I had to act fast. I pressed my knuckles hard into her sternum, a move that usually gets even the most unresponsive patients to react. She didn't flinch. Not a moan, not a grimace. Just nothing. "Call a rapid," I barked at Marie, who fumbled for the call button, tears streaming down her face. As the alarm sounded through the ward, I stayed with Delphine, my mind racing through the steps I'd need to take if she flatlined. The room was thick with tension, the kind that makes every second feel like an eternity. Then it happened. Delphine's body jerked suddenly, like someone had hit a reset button. Her eyes flew open, wide and sharp, not the dull gaze of a sick woman, but something more. She gasped, drawing in a deep, ragged breath, and within seconds, she was sitting upright in bed, full of energy like nothing had ever happened. The change was so sudden and unnatural that I froze. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. Marie let out a strangled sob, covering her mouth in disbelief. "Lord have mercy," I whispered under my breath. Delphine turned to me, her dark eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach drop. "I was dead," she said, her voice steady and eerily calm. "I was standing right here watching you." I felt my blood run cold. "What?" Marie stammered. "Mama, what are you talking about?" Delphine ignored her, still staring at me. "You did the rub," she said, mimicking the motion I'd made on her chest. "You were scared. Thought I was gone, didn't you?" My throat went dry. There was no way she could have known that. She'd been completely unconscious, clinically out of it. "You called the rapid," she continued, her voice low and matter-of-fact. "But I came back. Had to." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure. "Delphine, you were unresponsive. You shouldn't have." "I know what I saw," she interrupted. "I saw everything. I was watching you from up there." She lifted a frail hand and pointed toward the ceiling. Marie was shaking her head, whispering prayers under her breath. I wanted to say something rational, something that would explain what had just happened, but there was nothing. No medical training could account for this. Delphine leaned back against the pillows, her energy suddenly waning. She looked at me again, her expression softer now. "You've got a strong spirit," she said quietly. "That's good. You'll need it." I didn't ask what she meant. I couldn't. My legs felt like jelly, and I just wanted to get out of that room. The rapid response team burst in a few moments later, their voices loud and urgent. But Delphine was already stable. "She's fine," I told them, my voice hollow. "She came back." The team looked at me like I was crazy, but I didn't care. I needed to get some air to clear my head. As I walked down the hallway, my hands trembling, I couldn't shake Delphine's words or the feeling that something beyond my understanding had just happened in that room. I never saw Delphine again after that day. She was discharged a week later, and I heard she went back to reading cards like nothing had ever happened. Story 3. I worked as a nurse at a pediatric hospital for a couple of years. I mostly did 3 12-hour shifts a week, but I liked picking up overtime when I could. The extra pay was always nice, and I honestly didn't mind the work, at least most of the time. This particular night I was covering a shift in the NICU. It was quiet, just the soft beeps of monitors and the occasional hum of nurses moving around. Night shifts have a strange rhythm, like time stretches and folds in weird ways. The usual hustle of the day fades, leaving behind something heavy and still. I was never one to get spooked easily, but I'd be lying if I said the hospital at night didn't give me the creeps sometimes, especially the 4th floor. Everyone who worked there knew the stories. People said the hallway right outside the oncology unit was haunted. You'd hear whispers about flickering lights, strange noises, and even sightings of a little boy wandering the halls. I figured it was just folklore, stuff that bored nurses made up to pass time. But that night I found out why those stories existed. It was around 3 a.m., that dead stretch of the night when your body starts begging for sleep and your brain feels like it's stuck in molasses. I needed a break, something to wake me up. The cafeteria on the 2nd floor had a coffee machine that brewed surprisingly decent coffee, so I decided to make the trip. The fastest way there was through a staircase by the oncology unit. Normally, I would have just gone the long way, but I was tired and didn't want to waste time. So I pushed through the automatic double doors that led to that hallway. The moment I stepped in, the air changed. It wasn't cold exactly, but it felt heavy, like walking through thick fog. The lights overhead flickered slightly, but I didn't think much of it. Old building, faulty wiring, you know how it is. Then I saw him. A little boy, maybe 6 or 7, was skipping down the hall in front of me. He had dark hair and wore these light-colored pajamas that looked a bit too big for him. My first thought was that a patient had gotten out of their room. Kids in hospitals sometimes wander off, confused or scared, so I wasn't too shocked. But it was weird. There weren't supposed to be any kids out on this side of the unit, especially not at that hour. "Hey, buddy," I called out softly, trying not to startle him. "You okay? Where's your room?" He didn't respond, just kept skipping, his feet tapping lightly against the tile floor. I took a few steps closer. "Hey, wait up! You can't be out here alone!" That's when he stopped. He didn't turn around right away, just stood there, frozen in place like he was listening for something. I felt this strange pressure in my chest, like I'd walked into a room where I wasn't supposed to be. My instincts told me to back off, but I couldn't just leave a kid wandering around. "Come on, it's late," I said, my voice wavering a bit. He turned his head slowly, just enough for me to see half of his face. And then, he was gone. Not like he ran off or ducked into a room. One second he was there, and the next, nothing. The hallway was completely empty. I blinked, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. I walked down the hall, my shoes squeaking against the floor, looking for any sign of him. Checked the doors, locked. No open rooms. My heart was racing now, thudding hard against my ribs. I told myself it had to be a trick of the light or my tired brain messing with me. But deep down, I knew what I saw. I turned back toward the staircase, every nerve in my body screaming at me to get out of there. My hand shook as I pushed the door open and hurried down the stairs, taking them two at a time. When I reached the cafeteria, the bright lights and hum of the machines felt surreal, like I'd stepped into a different world. I poured myself a cup of coffee with shaky hands, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But here's the thing. I never told anyone what happened that night. Not my coworkers, not my friends, nobody. Story 4. I work nights at a psychiatric facility. We see plenty of strange things here. People shouting at invisible figures, pacing the halls like they're being chased by shadows, that kind of thing. It's usually just the mind playing tricks. That's what we tell ourselves anyway. The place itself doesn't help. The walls are painted this dull, institutional beige, and the overhead lights flicker just enough to make you uneasy. At night, when things are quieter, the building hums with weird noises. Pipes knocking, doors creaking, random mechanical clunks echoing down the halls. You get used to it, or at least you try to. This happened last month. I was stationed on the 3rd floor. It's where we house the more stable patients, the ones who just need observation and medication management. Everything was pretty routine that night until it wasn't. It started with one of the patients. Let's call her Miss Weaver. She was in her 60s, a sweet but fragile lady who'd been admitted for severe anxiety and mild paranoia. Usually she was cooperative and polite, but that night she was agitated, kept ringing the call button and asking us to switch her room. "There's a man in here," she insisted, her voice trembling. I exchanged a glance with the tech who was covering the floor with me. Delirium wasn't uncommon, especially with older patients. Miss Weaver wasn't violent or dangerous, just scared. "There's no one in your room, Miss Weaver," I said gently. "We checked the cameras, and I promise, no one's come in or out except you." She shook her head violently. "He's standing in the corner. He just stands there, watching." Her words made the hairs on my arms stand up. I glanced at the corner she was pointing to. Empty, of course. "I'll check again, okay? Just to make sure." She seemed a little reassured by that, so I left the room, signaling to the tech to keep an eye on the monitor while I did a sweep of the hallway. Nothing. The other patients were either asleep or quietly watching TV in their rooms. No strange visitors, no signs of anyone who didn't belong. I returned to Miss Weaver's room, where she was huddled under her blanket, still staring at that same corner. "No one's here," I told her again, keeping my voice calm. "I double-checked. Maybe it's just a trick of the shadows. You'll feel better with some sleep, I promise." She didn't look convinced, but she lay back down, her face tight with fear. I closed the door softly behind me and returned to my station, thinking that was the end of it. I was wrong. Maybe half an hour later, the tech, Sarah, nudged my arm. "Hey," she whispered. "You seeing this?" She pointed to the monitor displaying the hallway outside Miss Weaver's room. There was movement, a figure in the grainy black and white footage, pacing slowly back and forth in front of her door. "What the hell?" I muttered, leaning in closer. It looked like a man, dressed in what seemed like a hospital gown, though the image was too fuzzy to make out details. He moved with this eerie, deliberate grace, like he wasn't in any kind of hurry. "Is he one of ours?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with unease. I shook my head. "No way. All our male patients are on the 1st and 2nd floors." Without thinking, I grabbed my radio and stood up. "Stay here," I told Sarah. "Lock the door if you need to." She didn't argue. I headed down the hallway, my shoes squeaking on the tile. The air felt thick, heavier than usual. The closer I got to Miss Weaver's room, the stronger the sensation grew. Like I was walking into a space that didn't want me there. I rounded the corner, heart thudding in my chest. And there he was, a man, just like on the monitor, standing perfectly still in front of her door. He was tall, gaunt, and dressed in a pale, stained hospital gown that barely reached his knees. His head was bowed, hair hanging over his face. "Sir?" I called, my voice firm despite the lump forming in my throat. He didn't move. "Sir, you're not supposed to be here. I need you to come with me." Nothing. I took a cautious step closer, my hand instinctively hovering near the radio clipped to my belt. The figure shifted slightly, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of his face. My stomach dropped. There was nothing there. No eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, featureless expanse of pale skin, stretched tight over bone. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my feet were rooted to the floor. The man, or whatever it was, lifted one hand, palm open, and gestured toward me. It was an unmistakable beckoning motion, like he was inviting me closer. "Nope," I whispered under my breath, backing away slowly. As soon as I moved, he was gone. No fading, no dissolving into smoke. Just gone, like he'd never been there. I stood there breathing hard, my mind racing to make sense of what I'd just seen. But there was no sense to be made. I forced myself to check Miss Weaver's room, half expecting to find her gone too. But she was there, fast asleep and peaceful for the first time that night. I hurried back to the station, where Sarah was pale and wide-eyed. "You saw that, right?" I asked, my voice shaking. She nodded slowly. "He just disappeared." Neither of us spoke for a long time. We didn't report it. What were we supposed to say? That we'd seen a faceless man wandering the halls, beckoning like some kind of nightmare come to life? No one would believe us, but Miss Weaver never asked to switch rooms again. Story 5. I used to work in a nursing home on the night shift, both as a CNA and later as an LPN. If you've ever done night shifts in a place like that, you'll know how quiet it gets, eerily so. The kind of quiet that makes your own footsteps sound wrong, like you're disturbing something that's meant to stay silent. Most nights were uneventful. I'd do my rounds, check on the residents, make sure nobody had fallen or needed help getting to the bathroom. You get used to the strange noises, the creak of an old building, the hum of the fluorescent lights, even the occasional muttered words from a resident talking in their sleep. But there was one night, one shift that I can't forget. I still think about it every now and then, and every time I do, I get that cold, crawling feeling up my spine. It was around 3:30 in the morning. I just finished charting for the night and was heading back down the hall to check on a woman who had passed away a few hours earlier. We'll call her Mrs. Patterson. She was a sweet old lady, always quick with a smile, even when the dementia started to take pieces of her away. Her family hadn't made it in time to say goodbye, so it was just me and her when she went. Peaceful, at least. Quiet. After someone passes, part of my job was to clean them up, wash their face, straighten the sheets, get everything looking respectable before the funeral home arrived. It's not as eerie as people think, usually. There's a sense of duty to it, like you're helping them take their last steps out of this world. That night, though, that night was different. I pushed open the door to her room, and right away, something felt off. The air was heavy, like walking into a room that hadn't been aired out in years. The overhead light flickered once, then went steady. I told myself it was just the building being old. It did that sometimes. Mrs. Patterson was lying there, peaceful as ever, her thin hands folded over her chest. I started talking to her out of habit, like I always did with residents, alive or not. "All right, Mrs. Patterson," I said softly. "Let's get you cleaned up nice and proper." I dampened a cloth at the sink and wiped her face gently. As I worked, the room was dead silent, except for the faint hum of the lights. The door to her room was closed firmly behind me. I'd made sure of it when I came in. Privacy was important, even now. And then it happened. The door. That heavy, solid wood door that latched firmly into place. It swung wide open. Not a slow creak, not a nudge from a draft. It flew open so fast it slammed against the wall with a bang that echoed down the empty hallway. I froze, my hand still on Mrs. Patterson's arm. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring at that open doorway, expecting, I don't know what. A nurse walking in by mistake, maybe. Someone messing around. But there was no one. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaking just a little. No answer. I walked to the doorway, my legs feeling like lead. I leaned out into the hall, looking left and right. Empty. Just the long stretch of dimly lit corridor, doors to other rooms shut tight. Not a sound, not a shadow, nothing. My first thought was that maybe the latch was loose, that I hadn't closed it as firmly as I thought. But when I checked it, the latch was perfectly fine. It clicked solidly into place when I pushed the door shut again. There was no draft, no reason for that door to have opened like that. I tried to brush it off. Just a fluke, I muttered under my breath. Old building, weird things happen. But as I turned back toward Mrs. Patterson, every hair on my body stood on end. Her bed sheets, those neatly tucked sheets I had just smoothed out, were rumpled, like someone had grabbed them with both hands and pulled. The cloth I'd been using to clean her face was lying on the floor, even though I was sure I'd left it on the bedside table. I didn't move for a long moment, my breath caught in my throat. I wanted to believe I just knocked the cloth over without noticing, that maybe I'd pulled the sheets myself somehow without realizing it. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The air in the room felt colder now, sharp against my skin. The kind of cold that sinks into your bones, not the kind you get from an AC unit. I forced myself to finish up quickly, my hands shaking as I straightened the sheets again and placed the cloth back where it belonged. Rest easy, Mrs. Patterson, I whispered, more for myself than for her. I backed out of the room, not taking my eyes off the bed until I was in the hallway again. The door stayed open this time. I didn't care. I just wanted to be away from whatever had just happened. The rest of the shift dragged on, every creak and flicker of the lights making me jump. I didn't tell anyone about it. What was I supposed to say? Hey, I think Mrs. Patterson's ghost didn't want me cleaning up her room? Yeah, that would have gone over real well. I never saw or heard anything like that again. Story 6. I work as a nurse on the night shift at a care home specializing in Alzheimer's and dementia patients. It's not a job for the faint-hearted, let me tell you. Nights are long, quiet, and heavy with tension. People imagine the worst part is dealing with wandering patients or cleaning up after accidents. But that's nothing compared to what I saw one particular night. That night changed how I see this place, and my job, forever. The home itself sits on the edge of a small, sleepy town surrounded by thick woods. On stormy nights, wind howls through the branches and rattles the windows, making the whole building feel like it's about to give in. That night wasn't stormy, though. It was dead quiet, the kind of silence that presses on your chest. I was doing my usual rounds, checking rooms and making sure all the residents were settled. Most of them were asleep by then, their breathing steady, their thin blankets rising and falling gently. The dim hallway lights flickered every now and then, but I was used to it. Nothing about that seemed unusual. Then I heard it, a scream. It came sharp and high-pitched, slicing through the silence like a blade. I froze for a second, heart racing. Screams aren't unheard of here. Sometimes patients have nightmares or get disoriented and panic. But this scream was different. There was sheer terror in it, not confusion. I rushed toward the source, Mrs. Hendricks' room at the far end of the hall. She was one of our more difficult residents, often lost in vivid delusions, but she was usually calm at night. Not tonight. When I opened her door, the first thing I saw was her wheelchair tipped on its side near the bed. Mrs. Hendricks, who wasn't supposed to be able to stand without help, had somehow managed to climb halfway into it in a blind panic. Her frail arms shook as she gripped the armrests, trying to pull herself up fully. "Mrs. Hendricks," I said, rushing to her side. "What's wrong? What happened?" She didn't respond immediately, just kept gasping for air, eyes wild and darting around the room like she was searching for an escape route. "Fire!" she shrieked, voice cracking. "The fire! We have to get out. We're all going to burn." I glanced around the room, my pulse still hammering. There was no fire, no smoke, nothing out of the ordinary except her sheer terror. "Mrs. Hendricks, there's no fire," I said firmly, though my voice wavered. "You're safe. Look, no flames, no smoke. You're okay." She shook her head violently, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. "I see it," she sobbed. "It's everywhere. Can't you smell it? It's burning. Burning everything." Her words hit me hard. I'd read about this kind of thing before. How hallucinations for dementia patients aren't just figments of their imagination. When their brain tells them there's a fire, they don't just think it, they see the flames, smell the smoke, feel the heat. To them, it's real. But there was something unsettling about this episode. It wasn't just a typical delusion, it felt wrong. The air in the room was heavy, almost stifling, like something unseen had wrapped itself around us. "I swear to God," Mrs. Hendricks whispered, her voice raw. "It's crawling up the walls." A chill ran down my spine. I knew it was just her mind playing tricks on her. It had to be. But then, a sudden wave of heat hit me. It was brief, just a flash, but strong enough to make my skin prickle. I instinctively looked around, heart pounding. Nothing. No source of heat. No reason for it. The room was as still as ever, except for Mrs. Hendricks' ragged breathing and the faint buzz of the fluorescent light. I tried to shake it off. "Come on," I said, forcing my voice to stay calm. "Let's get you back to bed, okay?" She resisted, gripping the wheelchair tighter. "You don't believe me," she hissed. "But it's here. It's right there." Her bony hand shot out, pointing toward the corner of the room near the closet. My stomach twisted. I didn't want to look, but I did. There was nothing there, just shadows pooling where the light didn't reach. But those shadows, they seemed darker than they should have been, almost thick, like they were pressing in on the space around them. I swallowed hard. "There's nothing there," I said, more to convince myself than her. Suddenly, the fluorescent light above us flickered violently, casting strange, jagged shapes across the walls. For a split second, I thought I saw something. A flicker of movement in the corner where Mrs. Hendricks had pointed. A shape, tall and warped, almost like it was made of smoke. I blinked, and it was gone. My heart raced. Logic screamed that it was just my imagination, fueled by exhaustion and Mrs. Hendricks' hysteria. But the weight in the room, the heat, that flicker of movement, I couldn't shake it. Mrs. Hendricks let out a low, guttural moan, her whole body trembling. "It's gone now," she whispered, voice hollow. "But it'll come back. It always does." I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't want to know. After that, I managed to get her back into bed, though she kept muttering under her breath about fire and shadows. I stayed with her until she finally drifted into a restless sleep, her frail chest rising and falling unevenly. When I stepped out into the hallway, the air felt lighter, the oppressive weight gone. The flickering lights had stabilized, casting their usual dull glow over the worn linoleum floor. I told myself it was just another delusion, just another night on the job. But deep down, I knew better. Some things can't be explained, and whatever had been in that room with us, it wasn't just in Mrs. Hendricks' mind. Story 7, I used to work as a med tech at an assisted living facility a few years ago. It wasn't a glamorous job, but I liked helping people, and there was always something going on to keep things interesting, or weird, depending on the day. The place was a single-story building with long hallways that felt like they stretched forever, lined with identical doors leading to each resident's room. There was one resident, I'll call Margaret. She'd lived there for a couple of years and was known for being polite but fiercely independent. Even in her late 70s, she didn't want much help and had a bit of a stubborn streak. The kind of lady who'd wave you off if you fussed too much, but would sneak you a candy from her stash when nobody was looking. Then one afternoon, Margaret suddenly passed away in her room. It wasn't entirely unexpected. She'd had a bad heart, but it still hit us all hard. Her family came by later that day to collect a few things, but they left most of her belongings in the room, including her emergency call pendant, which hung on the bedpost. The facility had a rule. Rooms had to stay empty for a few days after someone passed, just to air them out and clean thoroughly before assigning a new resident. That night, Margaret's room was locked, dark, and quiet, or at least it should have been. I was working the night shift with a couple of other staff members when Margaret's neighbor, Mrs. Henson, called the nurse's station. "There's someone talking in the room next door," she said, her voice sharp with annoyance. "It's keeping me awake." I glanced at the board showing the room statuses. Margaret's room was marked empty. "You sure?" I asked, already dismissing it in my head. "Of course I'm sure," Mrs. Henson snapped. "I'm not imagining it." I sighed. We'll check it out. After hanging up, I turned to my coworker, Lisa. It's probably just the air vents making noise, she said, shrugging. We were used to strange complaints on the night shift. Phantom smells, mysterious drafts, TVs turning on by themselves when residents forgot the timers. You learned not to take everything too seriously. About an hour later, I was organizing medications when I heard the soft, insistent beep, beep, beep of a call light. I glanced up at the screen, expecting to see one of the usual rooms, but my stomach dropped. Margaret's pendant. The screen clearly showed room 117. Margaret's empty room. Lisa and I exchanged a look. Must be a glitch, she said, but her voice wasn't as steady as before. I'll go turn it off, I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. You sure? Lisa asked. Yeah, it's fine. The hallway stretched out in front of me, dimly lit by the flickering overhead lights. My footsteps echoed on the linoleum floor as I walked toward Margaret's room. The temperature seemed to drop the closer I got, and by the time I reached the door, I could see my breath fogging in the air. It was the middle of summer and the facility's air conditioning was off for the night. There was no reason for it to be this cold. I hesitated with my hand on the doorknob. Get a grip, I muttered to myself and pushed the door open. The room was pitch black except for the faint glow of the pendant light flashing on the wall. I stepped inside, my shoes squeaking on the cold tile. The air was thick, heavy, and I could smell something faintly metallic, like old coins or blood. I shivered, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. As I reached for the call button on the wall, there was a sudden loud bang. I jumped, my heart slamming against my ribs. The bathroom door had just slammed shut by itself. For a second, I couldn't move. My brain was scrambling for an explanation. Maybe a draft? But there was no air moving in the room. The windows were sealed and the AC was off. I forced myself to take a step toward the bathroom door, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. It wouldn't turn. Locked. I stood there, breathing hard, my mind racing. I knew for a fact that door didn't have a lock. None of the bathrooms in the facility did. It was a safety issue for the residents. I backed away, my pulse thundering in my ears. Screw this, I whispered and bolted out of the room. When I got back to the nurse's station, Lisa took one look at me and her eyes went wide. What happened? She asked. The door slammed, I said, breathless. And it's locked. I couldn't open it. That door doesn't lock, Lisa said, her face going pale. I know. We sat there in stunned silence for a few seconds before Lisa muttered, I'm not going down there. Neither am I said, but we both knew we couldn't just leave it like that. Eventually, we convinced one of the older male staff members, Joe, to check it out. He grumbled the whole way down the hall, calling us wimps and saying we were imagining things. When he came back, he looked shaken. Well? Lisa asked nervously. The door was still locked, Joe said quietly. Had to force it open. There was nobody in there. We didn't talk about it again after that night, but none of us ever volunteered to check room 117 alone again. Margaret's room stayed empty for a long time after that, and I never forgot how cold it was in the middle of summer, or the sound of that door slamming shut all by itself. Story 8. I grew up in Dallas, Texas, hearing stories about haunted places, the old Baker Hotel, the house on Swiss Avenue, and of course, hospitals. My mom was a night nurse in the burn unit at one of the biggest hospitals in the city. She didn't believe in ghosts, not really, but there was this one story she told me that still makes my skin crawl. The burn unit had a reputation. People whispered about strange things happening there. Figures standing by patients' beds, lights flickering without reason, and doors that opened or closed on their own. Nurses swapped stories during shift changes like it was just another part of the job. My mom always brushed it off. It's just nerves, she'd say, or sleep deprivation. People see what they want to see. That changed the night the little girl came in. It was a brutal night shift, one of those muggy Texas evenings when the heat sticks to your skin like a second layer. My mom had been there since 7 p.m., already exhausted from dealing with a full unit and the endless beeping of monitors. Around midnight, the paramedics brought in a young girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with burns covering most of her body. Her house had caught fire while she was sleeping. Somehow she made it out alive, but just barely. My mom said she'd never forget the way the girl looked when they wheeled her in. Skin raw and peeling, patches of blackened flesh that looked more like charcoal than human tissue. Her breathing was shallow, and her little body convulsed with every labored breath. The paramedics didn't say much, just handed over her file and gave that grim look that meant they didn't expect her to survive the night. They stabilized her as best as they could. IV fluids, oxygen, pain meds, but it was touch and go. My mom stayed by her side, adjusting monitors and checking vitals while the girl drifted in and out of consciousness. She said the worst part wasn't the burns. It was the way the girl's eyes would flutter open, wide and panicked, like she was seeing something that wasn't there. She kept whispering, my mom told me, but her voice was so weak I couldn't make out the words. At one point, the girl's heart rate spiked and alarms started blaring. My mom leaned in close, trying to calm her down. That's when the girl finally spoke clearly. "They're coming," she rasped, her voice cracked and broken. "Who's coming, sweetheart?" my mom asked, thinking maybe she was talking about her family. "The dark people," the girl whispered, eyes locked on something just past my mom's shoulder. Chills ran down her spine. She told herself it was just the meds messing with the girl's mind, hallucinations brought on by trauma and pain. But when she turned around to glance at the empty hallway behind her, something wasn't right. The lights in the hallway flickered once, twice, then went out completely. The only illumination came from the dim emergency lights above the nurse's station. The air felt thick, heavy, like the whole room had been sucked into a vacuum. My mom's first thought was to call maintenance about the power issue, but before she could reach for the phone, the temperature dropped. Not just a little. It was like stepping into a freezer. Her breath fogged up in front of her, and she could see goosebumps rising on her arms. Then she heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing through the hallway. At first, she thought maybe it was another nurse or a doctor making rounds, but the sound wasn't right. The footsteps were too heavy, too wrong. Like whoever or whatever it was didn't belong there. My mom's instincts kicked in. She positioned herself between the girl and the hallway, ready to call for security if need be. But when she looked down the corridor, her voice caught in her throat. There was a figure standing at the far end of the hallway, just beyond the reach of the emergency lights. Tall, featureless, cloaked in shadow. My mom said it was like looking at a void, something that absorbed light rather than reflected it. She wanted to move, to do something, but her body wouldn't cooperate. Fear rooted her to the spot. The girl on the bed started convulsing again, monitors blaring. My mom snapped back into action, grabbing the crash cart and preparing for the worst. But as she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was watching her, waiting for something. Then it started moving toward them. The shadows seemed to ripple around it as it glided. Not walked, but glided closer. My mom swore it didn't make a sound, even though she could still hear those impossible footsteps echoing in her head. She tried to focus on the girl, who was gasping for air, eyes rolling back into her head. "Stay with me, sweetheart," my mom whispered, her voice trembling. "Just stay with me." The figure was almost at the door now, its presence filling the room like a suffocating fog. My mom's hands shook as she fumbled with the defibrillator pads, desperate to shock the girl's heart back into rhythm. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the alarm stopped. The girl's breathing steadied, her body relaxed, and the monitors showed normal vitals. My mom blinked in disbelief, her pulse still racing. She looked up, expecting to see the figure standing in the doorway. It was gone. The hallway lights flickered back on, the temperature returned to normal, and the oppressive weight lifted from the room. My mom stood there, shaken and drenched in sweat, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The girl opened her eyes, clear and calm for the first time since she'd arrived. "They're gone," she whispered, a faint smile on her cracked lips. "You made them go away." My mom didn't know what to say. She just nodded, too rattled to speak. Later, when the attending doctor came by to check on the girl, he remarked on her miraculous recovery. "I thought for sure we'd lose her," he said. "But whatever you did, it worked." My mom never told anyone about what she saw that night. She knew they'd chalk it up to stress or exhaustion, just like she had with all the other stories. But she knew better. After that shift, she stopped dismissing the rumors about the burn unit being haunted. She never saw the shadow figure again, but she never forgot it either. And neither do I. Story 9. I was about halfway through my internship at an obstetrics hospital in a rural part of the province. The hospital itself was outdated and eerie at night, with dim flickering lights and endless hallways that echoed with every footstep. Most of the staff avoided staying too late if they could help it, but as a medical intern, I didn't have that luxury. My shift typically ended around 2 a.m., and by then, the entire building was unnervingly quiet. That night was just like any other, long, exhausting, and filled with the usual chaos of labor and delivery emergencies. By the time I clocked out, the hospital was dead silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional creak of old pipes. I tossed my stethoscope into my bag and started the walk back to my quarters, which were just a short distance from the hospital, past a narrow hallway that led to the older, rarely used wing. I remember being too tired to even think straight. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly as I trudged down the hall, my shoes tapping against the cold tile floor. My head was down, focused on getting through that last stretch before collapsing into bed. Then I saw her. A little girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old, darted into the hallway ahead of me. She wore a pale pink dress that shimmered under the flickering lights. Her hair was dark and wild, bouncing as she skipped and spun in circles like she was playing a game. For a moment, I thought my sleep-deprived brain was playing tricks on me. A kid? Here? At this hour? It made no sense. "Hey!" I called out instinctively, my voice echoing off the walls. She didn't stop. Instead, she giggled, a high, melodic sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't the kind of laughter you hear from a normal child. There was something strange about it, something too sharp, too cold. I quickened my pace, my shoes squeaking against the tiles as I followed her down the corridor. "Hey, wait! Where are your parents?" I called again, my voice tightening with unease. She rounded a corner without looking back. I jogged after her, my heart thudding harder with each step. The hall she led me into was darker, one of the older sections of the hospital that hadn't been renovated in years. Most of the rooms here were empty, their doors sealed shut. The lights flickered sporadically, casting long, warped shadows across the walls. I slowed down, my breath heavy in my chest. "Little girl?" I called softly, my voice cracking. The hallway stretched ahead, silent and empty. I strained my ears, listening for the sound of footsteps or laughter, but there was nothing, just an oppressive, suffocating silence. My pulse quickened. There was no way a child could have disappeared that fast. I should have heard something. Footsteps, a door opening, anything. I walked further down the hall, my eyes darting from side to side, scanning the darkened doorways. A cold draft brushed past me, raising goosebumps on my skin. And then I saw her again. She stood at the far end of the hallway, facing the wall with her back to me. Her tiny frame looked impossibly still, almost like a doll propped up against the cold concrete. The pink dress she wore was unnaturally bright in the dim light, almost glowing. My mouth went dry. "Are you okay?" I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't move. Something about the way she stood there, completely rigid, motionless, made my stomach twist. My instincts screamed at me to turn around and walk away, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from her. My fingers tightened around the strap of my bag as I forced myself to take a step closer. "Where are your parents?" I asked again, my voice trembling. "You shouldn't be here." Before I could finish, she turned. It wasn't a slow, natural movement. Her head snapped around first, followed by the rest of her body, as if she were being yanked by invisible strings. Her face, God, her face wasn't right. Her eyes were too large, too black, and they gleamed with a malevolent intensity that froze the blood in my veins. Her mouth stretched into a grin that was too wide, too sharp, like it didn't belong on a child's face. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air grew thick and heavy, pressing down on my chest like a weight. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body refused to cooperate. I could only stand there, paralyzed by the sheer wrongness of what I was seeing. And then she started laughing. The same cold, high-pitched giggle echoed through the hallway, bouncing off the walls like some twisted nursery rhyme. It was a sound that didn't belong in this world, a sound that clawed its way into my ears and lodged itself deep in my skull. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. My legs finally obeyed me, and I turned, sprinting back the way I came. My heart hammered in my chest as I raced down the corridor, the shadows twisting and warping around me. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. The thought of seeing her there, grinning and laughing, was too much. The hallway seemed endless, stretching out before me like some nightmare maze. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but I didn't stop until I burst through the doors and into the main wing of the hospital. The harsh fluorescent lights blinded me for a moment, but I didn't care. I kept running until I reached the front desk, where the night shift nurse was dozing off in her chair. She jolted awake as I skidded to a stop, my chest heaving. "What the hell happened to you?" she asked, eyeing me with a mixture of concern and irritation. There's a girl," I gasped, struggling to catch my breath. "A little girl in the old wing. She shouldn't be there." The nurse's expression hardened. "What are you talking about?" "I saw her," I insisted, my voice shaking. "She was playing in the hall, and then I don't know what the hell she was, but she's there." The nurse's face went pale. She glanced around nervously before leaning in closer. "You shouldn't have gone down that hallway," she whispered. "No one does." "What do you mean?" I demanded, my skin prickling. She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the dark corridor in the distance. "They say there's a ghost," she said quietly. "A little girl who died here years ago. People see her sometimes, running and laughing, just like you said." My stomach dropped. I wanted to laugh, to tell her that ghosts weren't real, that I was just tired and imagining things. But deep down, I knew what I had seen, and it wasn't a figment of my imagination. I didn't say another word. I just nodded numbly and backed away from the desk, my mind racing. As I made my way back to my quarters, the weight of what I'd experienced settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I didn't sleep that night, or any other night I had to work the late shift at that hospital. And I never walked down that hallway again. Story 10. I've worked night shifts at the hospital for years, mostly in the same ward. You get used to strange noises, creaks from old pipes, the occasional misfire of the call bells, and the shuffle of shoes on linoleum floors when someone forgets to lift their feet. You explain it all away. Hospitals have a way of settling into you until nothing surprises you anymore. Or so I thought. It was just past 3 a.m., that dead hour when patients are asleep and the ward falls into an eerie quiet. Even the monitors seemed to beep softer. I was at the nurse's station chatting with Emma, one of the HCAs who just finished doing last offices for an elderly patient who had passed peacefully earlier in the night. We were sharing stories to pass the time, the kind of casual banter you use to stay awake during the long hours. Suddenly, Emma paused mid-sentence, her face tilting slightly as if she'd heard something. "You hear that?" she asked. I frowned. "What?" She shook her head. "Never mind." We carried on talking, but there was this weird tension hanging between us now, like we were waiting for something to happen. I was trying to think of a way to lighten the mood when we both heard it. A sharp, distinct clatter of typing coming from the doctor's desk just around the corner. The thing is, no one was there. I froze, exchanging a glance with Emma. The typing continued, steady and deliberate, as if someone was working on a long report. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. "Maybe one of the doctors came in," Emma suggested, though her voice wavered. "They always check in first," I reminded her. "Say hello. Ask if there's anything urgent." "Well, maybe they forgot." She didn't sound convinced. I nodded toward the corner. "I'll go look." Steeling myself, I rounded the corner slowly, my rubber-soled shoes silent against the floor. The closer I got to the desk, the louder the typing seemed. Click, click, click. A steady rhythm like fingers moving fast across a keyboard. I stepped fully into the room and stopped dead. The chair was empty. The desk was clear except for a neatly stacked clipboard and a closed laptop. No one was there, but I could still hear the typing. I stood there, heart thudding hard in my chest, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was coming from a nearby computer. Maybe Emma had been right, and someone had forgotten to say hello and slipped away before I arrived. But that didn't make sense either. The sound was coming from right in front of me, where there was no one. I reached out and touched the keyboard. It was cold. The typing stopped. Silence rushed back into the room, thick and oppressive. I stared at the desk, willing some logical explanation to present itself. Nothing did. Footsteps echoed behind me, and Emma appeared at the doorway, her face pale. "Anyone there?" she whispered. I shook my head. She took a step forward, eyes flicking to the keyboard. "But I heard it too," she insisted. "Someone was there. They had to be." "I know," I said, my voice barely audible. Neither of us moved for what felt like forever. The air in the room had turned icy, and I swear there was this faint smell. Not quite antiseptic, not quite decay. Just wrong. "We should go," Emma said suddenly, her voice tight. I didn't argue. We walked back to the nurse's station in silence. Both of us rattled but too stubborn to admit it outright. Emma kept glancing over her shoulder like she expected someone to follow us. "Maybe it was nothing," she offered weakly after a long pause. But we both knew that wasn't true. That night, neither of us went back near the doctor's desk. And though we never talked about it again, I noticed Emma started requesting shifts on a different ward. I stuck around because someone had to, but I never shook that feeling. That something had been there, just out of sight, tapping away on keys that shouldn't have been moving. Story 1. I'm a psychiatric nurse. Early in my career, I worked at a residential mental health facility. There was a resident I'll call Marion Duchesne. He was an elective mute, which simply means that he didn't, wouldn't, couldn't talk, but there were no pathological findings as to why. He had spoken earlier in his life and seemed quite normal back then, with the notable exception of being close to 7 feet tall. He'd been raised in the Deep South and joined the military when he was 19. After boot camp, he was stationed somewhere in the South. One night, he just vanished. He was declared AWOL for years, and finally, he was declared missing and dead. 10 years later, a 7-foot-tall man walked into a VA hospital emergency room in my part of the Midwest and said to the receptionist, "My name is Marion Duchesne, and I've been dead for 10 years. Those were the last words he ever spoke. He was covered with dust, and he was wearing the same clothes he'd been reported to be wearing the night he vanished. His social security number had not been used, and he had no identification on his person. However, they were able to identify him, I guess via fingerprints. He was well fed and in good health, except for his refusal to speak. The family was notified, but they said they had already grieved their lost man, and that whoever was claiming to be him simply could not be. They said he was a haint and a stand-in for their dead relative and demanded not to be contacted again. Marion paced all day, every day, not in a frantic way, but just lumbering up and down the halls and outside. He smiled all the time and would be moving his mouth in a way that indicated talking or muttering, but he was dead silent. He had an unnerving habit of throwing his head back with his mouth wide open as if he were laughing heartily, but not even a breath could be heard. If told to go to the dining room for a meal, he'd go and eat. But if nobody told him, he just kept pacing, never indicating hunger. If offered a cigarette, he'd smoke it in an oddly formal way, almost delicately, if that makes sense. But he never seemed to crave smoking. The man wanted nothing. If I talked to him, he appeared to listen, periodically throwing his head back in that laughter-mimicking way of his. There was nothing to do for this man. Various medications were tried, but they did not affect him either positively or negatively. Occupational therapy did nothing because Marion would just grin, and unless told to stay put, he'd get up and start pacing again. On my last day at that job, on my way to something better, the last thing I saw was Marion, pacing in the parking lot, throwing his head back to laugh. Later, I wondered if all along I'd been dealing with a ghost. All these years later, I still don't know. Story 2. My auntie used to work as a nurse in a palliative care ward in a hospital. She always used to tell us this story about several strange things that used to happen when she worked night shifts. She worked the night shift with two other nurses on the left wing of the ward. The wing was made up of two sections with 8 beds in each. They had 8 patients in room 1 that evening. The nurses had looked after one particular gentleman for a while. He didn't often get many visitors as his wife had died years earlier and he'd lost touch with his daughter, so they quite often kept him company. He always used to ask the nurse to leave a light on by his bed so he could read if he couldn't get to sleep, or for the TV to be left on low. Apparently he liked the voices in the background and it comforted him knowing someone was there. For these reasons, they moved him into empty room 2 when they came into work around 9 p.m. so the noise, light, wouldn't bother the other patients. This became a little routine when the second room was empty. My auntie and the 2 nurses started their shift, as usual, one evening and sadly discovered that the gentleman had passed away earlier that afternoon. Room 2 was now empty again, with the 7 other patients in room 1. It was 11 p.m.-ish, and all the patients were asleep, and the only lights on were those illuminating the office section where the nurses were sat, along with computer monitors and the ceiling lights at the end of the hallway leading to the next wing. They were taking their break, having a coffee, and chatting when one of them suddenly stopped talking and held her hand up. They listened and could hear someone talking nearby. At first, they assumed it was someone from the next wing walking past, but the talking remained a few minutes later. My auntie looked around the corner to see if there was anyone there. No one. She turned back around to go towards the desk and saw a light shimmering in room 2. She called the other nurses and they went into the room. The bedside light was on, and the TV was on in the bay where the gentleman used to sleep. Auntie said they got the shivers, but it made them feel slightly emotional. However, they switched off the light and TV and went back to the desk. This happened on 7 other occasions over the following weeks, even when other nurses were working. Same light, same TV, always around 11 p.m. What my auntie said was so comforting, as she believed he enjoyed chatting with them and appreciated the extra effort they did to move him so he could watch the TV after hours. So he came back to see them again for their little ritual. The wards later filled up, and room 2 was being used more and more, so was rarely left unoccupied. One patient mentioned a light turning on and waking him up around midnight once, but he couldn't recall which one as he went back to sleep. The legend lives on and is explained to new staff who work there. Everyone on the ward to this day knows of the gentleman who likes to watch TV late at night, and they are told that if the room is empty, to make sure the volume isn't high and to let him watch like he used to. Story 3. A hospital doctor in Colorado. I have 3 stories. 1. Working overnights and getting a page that an old lady with dementia is flipping out. Says someone is in her room watching her around 2 a.m. Got this 3 or 4 times, and we decided to move her to a new room for other staffing issues. Move over an elderly man without cognitive impairment. 1 HR later, boom, same thing. Someone is in the room watching him, and the room is cold. I call bullshit and go check it out. Walk in, and the room is so goddamn cold I can see my breath. Have this eerie feeling something is watching me. Nope out, move the patient to a new room and leave the room empty all night. Side note, I ran 6 codes over 3 years in that room and never got a single one back. 2. The same hospital has a big burn unit. People flew in from around a 5-state radius. There was a Native American man that had that room for several months. Don't remember how he got burned, but was around 75% body surface area. Keep in mind, every single day they are washing these burns out, going to the surgery every few days to debride. It's horrible and not something I want any part of. Anyways, this guy eventually dies after months of this torture. Shortly after, weird electrical things were in there which I witnessed. Lights off on. The TV is suddenly on at full volume and won't turn off. Phone ringing and static on the other end. The RNs would walk in the room, say his name, and cut it out or stop, and I kid you not, Whatever it was would stop. Every single patient in that room for months after talked about seeing a Native American man. It got so bad that the hospital administrators legit called in a Native American shaman from his tribe to cleanse the room, had a ceremony and everything. After that, it never happened again. 3. This one creeps me out the most. Working at a different hospital and the on-call room is an old repurposed ICU room. The old hospital that expanded and they redid the old rooms. I'm in there asleep in the chair at 5 a.m. The nurses would sometimes pop their heads in the room, so I blocked it with a trash can and Harrison's Principles of Internal Medicine textbook, 5K pages. I'm drifting off to sleep when the door opens and someone walks in. Kinda looks like my partner that is supposed to be relieving me, but 2 HRs early. Strong feeling it's a female for some reason. Anyways, it walks over to where I'm sleeping, leans over, and hisses in my ear the worst goddamn sound I have ever heard. Sounded like an Aztec death whistle. Shit creepy. Didn't know it at the time, but heard it later. I shake myself awake and am freaked out. Figure it's just a night terror, but realize the door is pushed all the way open and the books are holding it open. Never slept in there again. You may not believe me, but these things all happen to me. Hospitals are weird places. Almost everyone that works nights has a hospital ghost story, but they aren't likely to tell you because it makes them seem crazy. Story 4. Growing up, my maternal grandmother and I were always pretty sensitive to paranormal stuff, but my mother was not. She thought her mom was a crock, and she was sure I was making stuff up, just as a preface. So while mom was in nursing school, she worked as a home health aide. She got a pretty cushy gig working with this disabled woman named Mary. I was too young to know what was wrong with Mary, but looking back now, I would guess she was someone who was mentally 5, though she was in her 50s. Mary's parents had provided well for her, left her with her giant, beautiful home, fully equipped for a handicapped person, enough money in a fund to finance care, etc. So mom was one of only 4 staff to work with Mary because she did not like new people. 2 midnighters and 2-day staff. She received around-the-clock care, but mom was able to bring Mary home with her, so we spent a lot of time with Mary as a family. Mary was sweet and very kind. I have an old photo of me, her and mom when I was dressed for one of my dance parades. We all loved her to death. One morning, on a day mom was off work but had school, she got up in a rush and ran downstairs. I thought she was late for school, so I went down with her to help her get what she needed to leave. But she was on the phone, dialing people who were not answering her. I will never forget this. Mom was shaking and crying, blubbering to herself without making any real sense. She finally slammed the phone down on the table and put her hands on her face, and I asked her what was wrong. She told me she had woke up to Mary at her bedside, patting her hand the way she did when she was very pleased with something mom did. But when she sat up in bed, Mary was gone. The phone rang, and it was the nurse at the house. Mary had passed away the night before. She came to tell mom goodbye. She still never believed in the paranormal, but she did quit nursing school and never worked in home health again. She never said, but I got the sense she couldn't handle another Mary happening to her again. My mom was pretty stoic, but that broke her. Story 5. I'm a chaplain who has worked in hospice. Near-death awareness is a known and accepted phenomenon in the hospice community. The dying will begin talking to loved ones who have died, talking about seeing different animals, sometimes old pets, and some even talk about seeing death or an angel of death. The one most interesting to me was a patient I worked with a few months from the time he was in oncology to his decline to death. He was open spiritually but had no religion. We held conversations about many spiritual things, so he was comfortable talking to me as he neared the end. One day he waited for his family and the nurse to leave, and then called me back into his room. He said to me, "I don't want to scare anyone else, and I don't want them to think I'm crazy. I can see death. I can see her out in the parking lot. She isn't ugly. My brother is with her." It should be noted that he had bone cancer located in his pelvis, which eroded it so badly that eventually an artery would burst and they wouldn't be able to stop the bleeding. He was on strong pain medications, but had nothing wrong with his brain and was entirely lucid. He talked about his family and his concerns for them and what he was leaving behind. A few days later, he called me into the room. He told me that death was now in the corner and she was calling him. He confessed he hadn't talked to his brother for years before he died, but he was so happy to see his brother with death calling to him. He asked me to pray for him in my religion, Christianity, because he did not know how to pray before he died. He died that night. I've had numerous other experiences with death awareness, but this one has always stuck out to me. I'm open to interpreting it as the dying psychologically preparing for death. My job is to help them reach the most peace as possible before death. And if this is just psychological, so be it. I know he and others have died well. Story 6. I'm a nurse. I've witnessed quite a lot of Alzheimer's people. They often develop their scenarios in their head, often accompanied by vivid hallucinations. Once during night shift, I heard a woman scream in fear. Checking on her, she managed to climb into her wheelchair in pure panic, wanting to flee her bedroom. Asking what was wrong, she thought the building was on fire. Now, what's important to mention here is that people often make claims that people are just crazy or dreaming badly or something, but this is not the case. People with hallucinations have been found to actually see, hear, smell, etc. Something when their hallucinations occur, as the same locations in the brain are stimulated as if they would get real impulses. That woman actually saw fire. She actually smelled fire. She didn't just make that up to be crazy. It's what her brain told her was happening, and she was in a real panic for her life. And the same applies when those people see someone else in their room. When they want me to guide someone out of the bedroom who isn't there, seemingly standing right behind me. And it makes no sense to discuss with them that no one is there. To them, someone is there. And you better do your best effort of improvising to guide that someone, even if it's no one outside. Play along, and they'll be fine. This, to me, is the scariest thing at work. They see something you don't. Story 7. Okay, I am a nurse, but this did not happen to me, but to several other nurses who worked at these units. There is a little girl who haunts the burn unit of a large military medical treatment facility in the U.S. She has been seen by both staff and patients. Haunts may not be the correct term, but she has been witnessed by several. Second, I used to work at the old Walter Reed Army Medical Center. In the old one that moved back in 2011, there was a VIP ward. I believe it was Ward 72. Any retired general officers would stay there, along with any higher-ups in the Gavat. Think Secretary of State and other cabinet officials. There was also a room for the First Lady and President. This ward is private, locked at all entrances, and very nice. It is furnished with very high-end furniture, and a lot of it was donated by Mrs. Mamie Eisenhower, the wife of President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Well, per my friend who worked there, the ghost of Mamie Eisenhower is very particular about anyone staying in her room. And if anyone did sleep in that room, she would yank off the bed sheets. My friends also said decorative pieces would randomly fall off the table or fly off the walls when they were the only ones up there. Mamie would also apparently page the supervisor, who would call the ward back to a very confused nurse as to who paged them. I floated up there 2-3 times during my time. My friend was on with me and told me all of this. I didn't believe her, so I went and sat in the room where Mamie would mess with people. I fell asleep, but sadly, nothing happened that night. Story 8. Oh shit, I got one. In med school, we had an anatomy exam on like Nov 1st or 2nd. So on Halloween night, I and my roommate decided that since everyone else was off partying, this would be a good time to get some uninterrupted studying going. Well, it was already creepy as hell being in the basement of the med school surrounded by cadavers. Well, an hour or so in, we're going through anatomy, And all of a sudden, on the other side of the lab, a faucet suddenly turns on. These faucets are the ones that have motion sensors on them, and we're on the other side of the lab. We were a bit creeped out, but dismissed it. We get back to work, and then it happens again, but on a different side of the room. Again, far from where we are. This happens maybe 2 more times, over an hour or so. Finally, we've had enough, and we decide to leave. As we're gathering our stuff and heading out, we remark to each other about a side room where the instructors will prep their lectures for exams, etc. We decide to pop our head in to see what was in there, and we stop dead in our tracks. As I said, we were the only ones in the lab, and we had heard no one else come in. In the side room, there is some person that we don't recognize bent over, working on a cadaver. Their back is to the door, and I and my friend were being plenty loud, yet they remain hunched over working on the dead body. We have no idea who this strange person is, and we've had it now. We slowly back out and get the fuck out of there. Story 9. I am a psychiatrist, and during my training years, I worked for 6 months at a ward treating patients with depressive and anxiety disorders. It was an old building that had been housing psychiatric patients since the mid-1920s. On our floor, we had 13 beds and a nursing station, a living room, and a few conference rooms. One day, a few weeks in, I am interviewing a patient who, when asked about sleeping patterns, tells me she has heard a baby crying at night, waking her up. There are no babies in that hospital as the place is situated far away from housing areas, and there were restricted visiting hours. Afterward, the nurse pulls me aside and tells me that the baby crying thing is not a psychotic symptom. She is very serious about this, but won't elaborate. I kind of shrug it off, as either way it does not change the diagnosis or treatment, and forget about the experience. Around 3 months into my stay, I sit in the nurse's station, and 3 nurses behind me are talking. One of them says, "She is very active today," and the other says, "Really? Oh, hadn't noticed." I turn around and ask them who they are talking about. They look at each other, and then one of them hesitantly says, "Well, there is a baby here. She cries sometimes." I, of course, say no, but they just kind of shrug and smile. Not 30 seconds later, I heard it. It sounded far away, but not too far. A cry. Clearly a baby's cry, sounding like it is separated from us by maybe 2 or 3 walls. I am perplexed and look at the nurses. They look at me like, "Told you so." I, of course, ask about this, but they can't say anything else but this faint baby cry is there and has been there always. Since then, I heard it maybe 2-3 times a week. I told a new doctor about it who laughed, however, a few weeks into her stay. She came to me, white as a sheet, and told me she heard it in their coffee break. All the nurses just kind of knew about it, and being in psychiatry, hearing that kind of stuff is not something you brag about. I was transferred and haven't heard it since. I think about it sometimes, but I don't know what to make of it. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.